Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Rowan Kincaid had been driving the Dalton Highway for 11 years, and he'd learned to respect the polar night. Not fear it exactly, but respect it the way you'd respect a wild animal that could turn on you if you stopped paying attention. The darkness up here wasn't like darkness anywhere else. It was thick, absolute, and it stretched on for weeks without a single glimpse of the sun. From mid-November through January, the sky above Alaska's North Slope never brightened beyond a dim twilight that lasted maybe 3 or 4 hours around noon. The rest was just blackness, broken only by headlights and the occasional flicker of aurora borealis dancing across the frozen sky. Tonight was his third run this month up to Deadhorse, hauling drilling equipment for one of the oil companies working the Prudhoe Bay fields. The temperature had dropped to 38 below zero, cold enough that his breath froze on the inside of his windshield despite the heater running full blast. Ice fog hung in patches along the road, so thick in places that his headlights couldn't penetrate more than 20 feet ahead. The Dalton was treacherous even in good conditions, but during polar night in the middle of winter, it became something else entirely. A 414-mile ribbon of ice and gravel cutting through absolute wilderness, where a breakdown could mean death if you weren't prepared. Rowan had learned to be prepared. His Kenworth was equipped with every cold weather modification available, from auxiliary fuel tanks to engine block heaters to a sleeping compartment insulated well enough to keep him alive, even if the engine died. He carried emergency rations, extra blankets, a satellite phone, and enough diesel to idle for 3 days straight if he had to wait out a storm. Most importantly, he carried respect for the road and the darkness that ruled it for half the year. The CB radio crackled with static as he passed mile marker 287, about 40 miles south of Coldfoot. Channel 19 was quiet tonight, which wasn't unusual. Most drivers preferred to make this run during daylight hours or at least during the brief twilight periods. Running at midnight meant you were either crazy, desperate for the money, or experienced enough to know what you were doing. Rowan liked to think he fell into that third category, though his ex-wife would probably have voted for the first one. He was reaching for his thermos of coffee when a voice came through the CB, faint and distorted by static. Northbound convoy approaching mile marker 290. We've got 4 rigs running heavy through the ice fog. Anybody up ahead, give us a holler on road conditions. Rowan grabbed the microphone and keyed it. This is northbound Kenworth at mile 287. You're about 3 miles back from my position. Road's rough but passable. Ice fog's thick in patches, so keep your speed down. Where are you boys headed? Static crackled for a long moment before the voice came back. Deadhorse, hauling equipment for Arctic slope operations. Appreciate the heads up on conditions. Something about the voice bothered Rowan, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Maybe it was the slight echo, or the way the words seemed to drift in and out of clarity. The CB could be temperamental up here, especially during auroras when the ionosphere got stirred up. Still, the hair on the back of his neck prickled in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "How long you been on the road?" Rowan asked, trying to place why the conversation felt off. Another pause, longer this time. "Left Fairbanks around 1600 hours. Made decent time until we hit the ice fog north of Yukon River." Rowan frowned. The Yukon River crossing was at mile marker 56, more than 200 miles south of his current position. If they'd left Fairbanks at 4 in the afternoon, and it was now just past midnight, that meant they'd been driving for 8 hours to cover 200 miles. That was possible in bad conditions, but it seemed slow, even for a convoy of 4 trucks running through ice fog. "You boys must be crawling along," he said into the microphone. 8 hours from Yukon crossing is rough timing." The static seemed to intensify, and when the voice came back, it sounded farther away. "Conditions have been worse than we expected. The fog's like nothing I've seen in 20 years of running this highway." 20 years. That detail caught Rowan's attention. Anyone who'd been driving the Dalton for 20 years would know this highway inside and out, would know how to time their runs and what to expect during polar night. The voice on the other end didn't sound like a rookie, but something in the way the driver spoke made Rowan uneasy. "What outfit are you running with?" Rowan asked, keeping his tone casual. "Static, then. Northern Freight Services. We're hauling drill components and prefab housing modules. Heavy loads, so we're taking it slow." Northern Freight Services. The name tugged at something in Rowan's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He'd hauled for most of the major companies working the North Slope over his 11 years, and he knew most of the independent operators by reputation, if not by name. Northern Freight Services sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember seeing any of their trucks at the Dead Horse yards or at any of the truck stops along the route. The miles rolled by beneath his wheels as he climbed higher into the Brooks Range. The road here was a series of long, grinding ascents and nerve-wracking descents, with drop-offs on one side that disappeared into darkness, so complete it felt like driving along the edge of the world. The ice fog came and went in waves, sometimes clearing enough to see 100 yards ahead, sometimes closing in so tight that Rowan had to slow to 15 miles an hour and navigate by memory as much as by sight. His OEB remained silent for the next 20 minutes. He watched his mirrors for signs of the convoy behind him, expecting to see their headlights appear as they closed the distance, but the darkness behind him stayed absolute. Either they were much farther back than the 3 miles they'd been when he first heard from them, or they were running without lights, which would be suicidal on this road. Just past mile marker 300, as he was negotiating a particularly nasty curve with a steep embankment on his right, the CB crackled back to life. "Northbound convoy to any drivers in the area. We're having some trouble. Engine problems on one of our rigs. We're pulled over at mile marker 294 if anybody's in position to assist." Rowan checked his GPS. Mile marker 294 was 6 miles behind him. He'd passed it maybe 10 minutes ago, and he hadn't seen any trucks pulled over. Of course, in the ice fog and darkness, it was possible to miss things. He'd known drivers to pass within 20 feet of a parked vehicle without seeing it if the fog was thick enough, and the parked truck's lights were off. But something about this situation was starting to feel very wrong. "Copy that," Rowan said into his microphone. "This is the Kenworth that was at 287. I'm at mile 300 now. What's the nature of your engine trouble?" The response came faster this time, and the voice sounded different. More urgent, almost desperate. "Fuel system's frozen up. We're losing power on rig number 3. Temperature's dropping fast, and we can't keep the engines warm enough to prevent gelling." That made sense. At 38 below, diesel fuel could start to gel if it wasn't properly treated with anti-gel additives. Most experienced drivers knew to use winter blend fuel and additives during polar night, but mistakes happened. Still, for a convoy that supposedly had been running the Dalton for 20 years, it seemed like a rookie error. "You boys treating your fuel?" Rowan asked. "We treated it in Fairbanks, but something's wrong. The cold up here is worse than anything we planned for." Rowan's frown deepened. 38 below wasn't unusual for this stretch of the Dalton in December. Any driver with 20 years of experience would know that and would plan accordingly. The inconsistencies were piling up, and his instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right. "What's your rig number?" Rowan asked. "And what's the name of your lead driver?" Static filled the silence for a long moment. When the voice came back, it had changed again. This time it sounded hollow, distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "Lead driver is Einar Holt. Been running this route since before you were born, friend. We just need some help getting this rig started again." Einar Holt. The name hit Rowan like a physical blow. He knew that name. Every driver who'd worked the Dalton for more than a few years knew that name. Einar Holt had been a legend among Alaska truckers, a tough old Norwegian who'd made hundreds of runs up the Dalton back in the early days when the road was even more primitive and dangerous than it was now. Einar Holt had also been dead for 17 years. Rowan knew because he'd been at the memorial service in Fairbanks, had listened to the stories about how Einar's truck had been found at mile marker 294, engine still running. But Einar himself was gone. They'd searched for weeks, but they never found his body. The official conclusion was that he'd gotten out to check something in the darkness and fog, become disoriented and wandered off into the wilderness to freeze to death. It happened sometimes up here, even to experienced drivers who should have known better. Rowan's hand was shaking as he keyed the microphone. Einar Holt died in 2006. What kind of sick joke is this? The static intensified until it was almost deafening, and underneath it, Rowan could hear something else. Voices, multiple voices, all talking at once but too distorted to make out individual words. The sound raised goosebumps on his arms despite the layers of clothing he wore against the cold. Then, cutting through the static like a knife, came a woman's voice. Clear, calm, and chillingly matter-of-fact. "They're not joking, Rowan. They don't know they're dead. They've been driving this road for 17 years, making the same run over and over, not understanding why they can never reach Dead Horse, why the darkness never ends, why every night is the same night they disappeared." Rowan nearly drove off the road. He jerked the wheel, feeling his trailer start to slide on the icy surface before he caught it and brought the rig back under control. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and his hands were slick with sweat inside his gloves despite the cold. "Who is this?" he demanded into the microphone. "How do you know my name?" The woman's voice continued, still calm, still clear. "My name is Mara Ellison. I was the dispatcher for Northern Freight Services 17 years ago. I was working the radio the night the convoy disappeared. I've been trying to warn other drivers ever since, but most of them can't hear me. The fact that you can hear both them and me means you're in danger, Rowan. You're somewhere between their reality and ours. And if you're not careful, you're going to end up just like them." Rowan's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, maybe other drivers messing with him over the CB. But how would they know his name? How would they know about Einar Holt and the convoy that disappeared in 2006? Those weren't widely known details outside of the tight-knit community of Dalton drivers. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "There's got to be a rational explanation for this." "There probably is," Mara's voice agreed. "But rational doesn't mean normal, and it doesn't mean safe. The polar night does strange things up here, Rowan. The darkness and cold and isolation, they create conditions where reality gets thin, where the past and present can overlap, where people who died years ago can still be driving these roads, not knowing they're trapped in a loop they'll never escape." The other voices were still there underneath the static, and now Rowan could make out some of the words. They were talking about road conditions, about ice fog, about making it to Dead Horse before the next storm hit, ordinary trucker conversation, except for the echo that made each word sound like it was bouncing off the walls of a vast, empty space. "Why mile marker 294?" Rowan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why there specifically?" "Because that's where it happened," Mara said. "That's where Einar and the other 3 drivers stopped because of engine trouble. That's where they got out of their trucks to try to fix the problem. And that's where something went wrong. The official report said they got disoriented in the ice fog and wandered off. But I was on the radio with them right up until the end, Rowan. I heard what they heard. There was something out there in the darkness with them. Something that shouldn't have been there." Rowan checked his mirrors again, and this time he saw them. 4 sets of headlights in the distance behind him, emerging from the ice fog like ghost ships sailing through mist. They were gaining on him, closing the distance faster than should have been possible for trucks hauling heavy loads on icy roads. "They're behind me," he said into the microphone. "I can see their lights." "Then you need to get ahead of them and stay ahead of them." Mara's voice took on an urgency that sent ice water through Rowan's veins. "Don't let them catch up to you. Don't stop if they ask for help. And whatever you do, don't pass mile marker 294 while they're near you. That's their point of anchor, the place where they're trapped. If you're too close to them when you pass that spot, you might get pulled into their loop with them." The headlights were definitely getting closer. Rowan could see them more clearly now in his mirrors. 4 sets of lights in a convoy formation, just like the voice on the radio had described. He pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his truck faster than was safe on the icy road, but he couldn't seem to increase the distance between himself and the pursuing convoy. "What happened to them?" he asked. "What was out there with them?" Mara's voice crackled with static. "I don't know. All I know is what I heard on the radio that night. Einar was talking about something moving in the fog, something that wasn't showing up on any of their headlights, but they could all see it. He said it looked like a person at first, someone walking along the road, but when they got closer they realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, the proportions were off, and then what? And then the screaming started, all 4 of them, all at once. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then silence. The trucks were still transmitting. I could hear their engines idling, but there was no one talking. I stayed on the radio all night, calling for them, but there was never any answer. By the time search and rescue reached the location the next morning, the trucks were found exactly where they'd stopped, engines still running, but all 4 drivers were gone. No footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle, nothing. Just empty trucks sitting on an empty road in the middle of nowhere. The convoy was close enough now that Rowan could make out details in his mirrors. The trucks looked old, older than they should have been. The headlights were the wrong style, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in 15 years. And there was something off about the way they moved, as if they weren't quite touching the road, as if they were gliding along just slightly above the icy surface. Rowan's GPS showed he was approaching mile marker 292, 2 miles from the anchor point where the original convoy had disappeared. The pursuing trucks were now less than a quarter mile behind him, and no matter how fast he pushed his rig, he couldn't seem to open up the distance between them. "I can't outrun them," he said into the microphone. "They're too close, and they're moving too fast." "Then you need to break the pattern," Mara's voice said. "They're locked into their route, repeating the same drive they made 17 years ago. If you do something they didn't do, something unexpected, you might be able to get out of sync with them." "Like what?" "I don't know. Stop before you reach 294. Turn around. Take one of the side access roads. Anything that breaks the pattern of driving straight through to where they disappeared." Mile marker 293 flashed past Rowan's window. 1 mile to go, and the convoy was now close enough that he could see details through the ice fog. The lead truck was a Peterbilt, older model with chrome stacks and a paint scheme that hadn't been popular since the early 2000s. Behind it were 3 more trucks, all of them with that same ghostly, not quite real quality that made Rowan's eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them directly. There was a pullout ahead on the right side of the road, a small gravel area where trucks could stop to check their loads or wait out bad weather. Rowan made a split-second decision. He hit his brakes, feeling the anti-lock system pulse as the wheels fought for traction on the ice, and swung his truck toward the pullout. The rig slid sideways for a heart-stopping moment before the tires caught, and he managed to get the truck stopped in the gravel clearing. Behind him, the convoy kept coming. They didn't slow down, didn't deviate from their path. They simply continued past his position, their headlights cutting through the fog and darkness as they drove toward mile marker 294. Rowan watched them go, counting the seconds, waiting for them to disappear into the distance. But they didn't disappear. Instead, as they reached the area where mile marker 294 should have been, the trucks began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone was slowly turning down their brightness and solidity. Within 30 seconds, they were gone completely, leaving nothing but darkness and swirling ice fog where they had been. Rowan sat in his idling truck, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. His rational mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Reflections, maybe. Heat mirages, though that seemed impossible in 38 below zero weather. Some kind of atmospheric phenomenon unique to polar night conditions. But he knew what he'd seen. And more importantly, he knew what he'd heard on the CB radio. "Mara," he said into the microphone, "are you still there?" Static answered him. Nothing more. He tried several different channels, but all of them were silent except for the hiss and crackle of empty airwaves. Whatever window had opened between his reality and that frozen moment from 17 years ago had apparently closed again. Rowan sat there for another 10 minutes, waiting for his heart rate to return to normal and his hands to stop shaking. The temperature in his cab had dropped despite the heater, and he realized he was soaked with sweat that was now freezing in the frigid air. He cranked the heat up higher and took several long swigs from his thermos of coffee, trying to warm himself from the inside. Eventually, he knew he had to make a decision. He could turn around and head back south, abandon this load and this run, and never drive the Dalton Highway again. Or he could continue north to Dead Horse, complete his delivery, and try to convince himself that what he'd just experienced was some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the psychological stress of driving through polar night darkness. In the end, it was professionalism that made the decision for him. He had a contract to fulfill, a load to deliver, and a reputation to maintain. More than that, he had 11 years of experience on this highway that told him the only thing more dangerous than completing the run was turning around and trying to drive it in reverse through the darkness and ice fog. He put his truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, heading north. As he passed the area where mile marker 294 should have been, he kept his eyes straight ahead and his speed steady. There was nothing to see anyway, just the narrow cone of his headlights cutting through the fog, the white line at the edge of the road, and the endless darkness that pressed in from all sides. But as he drove away from that spot, Rowan made himself a promise. Tomorrow, when he reached Dead Horse and had access to reliable internet, he was going to research Northern Freight Services and the convoy that disappeared in 2006. He was going to find out everything he could about Einar Holt and the other 3 drivers who had vanished into the polar night. And he was going to try to figure out what Mara Ellison had been trying to tell him about the thinness of reality during the long darkness. Because one thing was certain. What had just happened wasn't over. The convoy was still out there, still driving their endless loop through the frozen darkness, still searching for a destination they would never reach. And Rowan had a feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he encountered them on the long, lonely road through Alaska's winter night. The miles ahead stretched out into blackness, and somewhere in that darkness, 4 ghost trucks were still driving, still calling out on the CB radio, still looking for help that would never come. Rowan pressed the accelerator and drove on, counting the mile markers as they appeared and disappeared in his headlights, each one taking him farther from the haunted stretch of highway, but never quite far enough to forget what he had seen and heard. Behind him, lost in the ice fog and polar darkness, mile marker 294 stood silent and empty, waiting for the next driver who might be unlucky enough to hear voices from the past calling out on Channel 19, asking for help, not knowing they were 17 years too late to be saved. Rowan didn't stop again until he reached the truck yard at Coldfoot, 43 miles north of where he'd encountered the ghost convoy. The small settlement was little more than a truck stop, a few buildings, and a fuel station, but it represented civilization in a landscape that had none. He pulled into the lot at 3 a.m, his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel, and sat in his idling cab trying to decide what to do next. The smart thing would be to fuel up, grab some coffee, and continue north to Deadhorse. Finish the job, collect his pay, and put this night behind him. But the researcher in him, the part that had always been curious about the stories and legends that accumulated around remote highways, wouldn't let it go. He needed to know more about what had happened at mile marker 294 17 years ago. The truck stop was nearly empty at this hour. Just 2 other rigs parked in the lot, their engines idling to keep the cabs warm in the brutal cold. Rowan topped off his fuel tanks and headed inside, grateful for the blast of overheated air that hit him when he opened the door. The interior was what you'd expect from a Coldfoot truck stop. Worn linoleum floors, fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, a coffee station that looked like it had been there since the highway was built, and a small restaurant area with red vinyl booths. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a fleece jacket over her uniform. She looked up as Rowan entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd been expecting him, though that was impossible. "Coffee's fresh," she said, gesturing toward the station. "Made it 20 minutes ago when I heard trucks coming up from the south." Rowan poured himself a cup, black and strong enough to strip paint, and carried it to the counter. The woman was watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see the traces of what he'd just experienced written on his face. "Rough drive?" she asked. "You could say that," Rowan replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Ice fog's thick south of here." The woman nodded slowly. "Ice fog, right. That what you're calling it?" Rowan felt his stomach tighten. "What else would I call it?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even though they were the only people in the building besides a trucker asleep in one of the booths. "Son, I've been working this truck stop for 32 years. I've seen every kind of weather and road condition you can imagine. But I've also seen the look you've got on your face right now. That's not the look of someone who just drove through some fog. That's the look of someone who saw something they can't explain." Rowan took a long drink of his coffee, buying time to think. Part of him wanted to unload the whole story on her, to tell someone what had happened, and see if they believed him. But another part, the cautious part that had kept him alive through 11 years of dangerous driving, warned him to keep his mouth shut. The woman made the decision for him. "You passed mile marker 294 tonight, didn't you? Around midnight, maybe a little after?" The coffee cup froze halfway to Rowan's lips. "How did you know that?" "Because you're not the first driver to come through here with that look on their face. And you won't be the last." She glanced toward the sleeping trucker in the booth, making sure he was still out, then continued in an even lower voice. Every few months, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, someone drives through here in the middle of the night looking like they've seen a ghost. And when I ask them about it, when I really push them, they all tell me the same story. They heard voices on the CB, they saw lights behind them that shouldn't have been there. And they encountered something at or near mile marker 294 that they can't explain. Rowan set his cup down carefully on the counter. Did any of them mention Einar Holt? The woman's expression shifted, and for a moment something that looked like grief passed across her features. Most of them did. Einar was my brother-in-law, married to my sister for 23 years before he disappeared. She never recovered from losing him like that, not knowing what happened, not having a body to bury. She passed away 6 years ago, still wondering where he'd gone. "I'm sorry," Rowan said, and meant it. The voice on my CB tonight said it was Einar, said he'd been running this route for years. I thought someone was messing with me until they mentioned Northern Freight Services. The woman's eyes widened slightly. That's the detail that most of them don't know. Northern Freight Services went out of business 15 years ago, not long after Einar and the others disappeared. There's no reason anyone would know that name unless they were involved with the company or they actually heard it from someone who was. There was another voice, Rowan continued, his words coming faster now that he'd started. A woman named Mara Ellison. She said she was the dispatcher that night. She warned me not to let the convoy catch up to me, not to be near mile marker 294 when they reached it. The woman straightened up, her hand going to her throat. Mara. God, I haven't heard that name in years. She worked dispatch for Northern Freight, handled all their radio communications. After the convoy disappeared, she quit the industry entirely. Couldn't handle being on the radio anymore, knowing the last voices she'd heard were those drivers calling for help. "Is she still alive?" Rowan asked. "Still in Alaska?" "Far as I know, she moved down to Fairbanks about 10 years ago. Runs a small repair shop near the airport. But she doesn't talk about what happened that night. I tried to get her to tell me once, for my sister's sake, but she shut down completely. Said there were some things that were better left in the darkness where they belonged." Rowan pulled out his phone and made a note of the name and location. He'd be passing through Fairbanks on his way back south. Maybe if he could talk to Mara in person, he could get some answers about what had really happened at mile marker 294 and why it seemed to be happening again. "What do you think is out there?" he asked the woman. "What do you think happened to your brother-in-law?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring past Rowan toward the windows that looked out on the frozen darkness. "I think the polar night does something to this place. The darkness isn't natural, you know. Not darkness that lasts for months at a time. Human beings aren't meant to live in that. We're not meant to drive through it. And I think sometimes, when the conditions are just right and the darkness is at its deepest, reality gets thin up here. Things that should stay separate start to overlap. The past bleeds into the present. The dead don't always stay buried." "That sounds like superstition," Rowan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Does it?" The woman met his eyes. "You tell me what you saw tonight and then tell me it's superstition. You heard voices on your radio that shouldn't be there. You saw trucks that disappeared 17 years ago. You talked to a woman who quit the industry a decade ago and moved away from this highway. That sound like superstition to you, or does it sound like something else?" Rowan didn't have an answer for that. He finished his coffee in silence, paid for his fuel, and headed back out into the cold. As he was opening his truck door, the woman called out to him from the doorway of the truck stop. "Hey, one more thing." He turned back to face her. "If you do manage to track down Mara Ellison, if she actually agrees to talk to you about that night, you tell her something for me. Tell her that Sarah Kincaid says it wasn't her fault. Tell her that my sister never blamed her for what happened, and neither do I. Sometimes things happen in this darkness that are beyond anyone's control. Kincaid, Rowan repeated. Any relation to, you're a Kincaid with an E, the woman said. I'm a Kincaid with an I. Different spelling, probably no relation. But maybe not coincidence that you're the one who encountered them tonight. This highway has a way of connecting people in unexpected ways. Rowan climbed back into his cab and sat there for a moment, letting the heater warm him and thinking about what Sarah Kincaid had said. The idea that the highway itself might have some kind of consciousness, some ability to create connections between past and present, living and dead, seemed insane. But then again, everything about the last few hours had seemed insane. He pulled back onto the Dalton Highway and continued north toward Dead Horse. The ice fog had cleared somewhat, and visibility improved as he climbed higher into the Brooks Range. The darkness was absolute now, with no moon and only the faint glow of Aurora Borealis providing any light beyond his headlights. The road wound through mountain passes and across frozen rivers, each mile taking him deeper into one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. His CB radio crackled occasionally with static, but no voices came through. He kept it tuned to Channel 19, half hoping and half dreading that he might hear from the convoy again. But the airwaves remained silent except for the hiss and pop of electromagnetic interference. Around 5 in the morning, as he was approaching the Atagun Pass, the highest point on the Dalton Highway, his CB suddenly came to life with a burst of clear transmission. Any northbound drivers? This is southbound at Atagun. Roads clear over the pass, but winds picking up. Might want to secure your load before you start the climb. It was a normal, mundane trucker conversation, and Rowan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He keyed his microphone. Copy that, southbound. This is northbound approaching Atagun. Appreciate the heads up. How's it looking on the north side? Clear sailing down to Dead Horse. You'll have the road pretty much to yourself. There's only about 3 of us running tonight. 3 trucks. Rowan's relief evaporated. 3 including you? Yeah, me and 2 others. We all left Dead Horse around midnight, running together for safety. You're the first northbound we've seen since we started down. Rowan thought about the 2 trucks he'd seen idling in the lot at Coldfoot. If those trucks were still there, and this convoy of 3 was the only other traffic on the road, then who had been behind him at mile marker 294? Who had he seen disappearing into the fog? He knew the answer, but hearing it, confirmed by another driver, made it real in a way that was hard to deny. How long you been running the Dalton? Rowan asked, trying to keep his voice casual. 8 years. Why? You ever hear anything weird on the CB? Voices that shouldn't be there, trucks that appear and disappear? There was a long pause before the other driver responded, and when he did, his voice was guarded. I've heard stories. Most drivers who run this highway regularly have, but I've never experienced anything myself. You asking for a reason? Rowan made a decision. If he was going to understand what was happening on this highway, he needed to connect with other drivers who might have seen or heard similar things. I had an encounter tonight. Mile marker 294, around midnight. Heard a convoy on the CB that claimed to be 4 trucks running north. But when I looked into it, I think they might have been the trucks that disappeared back in 2006. The static stretched out for so long that Rowan thought the other driver had switched channels. Then, you talked to someone at Coldfoot, didn't you? The woman who runs the truck stop there. Sarah Kincaid, yeah. She tell you about her brother-in-law? Einar Holt. He was the lead driver in the convoy that disappeared. Another pause. Look, friend, I don't know what you saw or heard tonight, and I'm not going to tell you it wasn't real. This highway has a reputation, and it's not all bullshit. But if you're smart, you'll make your delivery in Dead Horse, Drive back south during daylight hours and try to forget about whatever happened at mile marker 294. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially up here during polar night. That's what everyone keeps telling me, Rowan said. But what if it happens again? What if other drivers encounter the same thing? Shouldn't we be trying to figure out what's going on? And what would you do if you figured it out? You think you can rescue 4 drivers who've been missing for 17 years? You think you can change whatever happened to them? All you'll do is drive yourself crazy, trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit into any rational framework. The other driver had a point, but Rowan couldn't let it go. There was a dispatcher named Mara Ellison. She was on the radio with them when they disappeared. She's living in Fairbanks now. I'm going to try to talk to her when I head back south. Good luck with that. I heard she won't talk about it with anyone. Maybe she will if I tell her I heard the same things she heard. Maybe she needs to know she's not the only one who experienced it. The southbound driver sighed. You're going to do what you're going to do. But I'll tell you this. Every driver who gets too curious about the strange things that happen on this highway ends up one of 2 ways. Either they quit driving it entirely, or they become part of the stories themselves. You think about which one of those you want to be. The transmission ended, and the CB fell silent again. Rowan crested Adigun Pass and began the long descent toward the north slope. Below him, stretching out to the horizon, was a vast plain of darkness broken only by the occasional lights of oil facilities. Deadhorse was still 80 miles away, but he could already see the glow of the industrial complex on the northern horizon. He thought about what the southbound driver had said, about mysteries being better left unsolved, about the danger of getting too curious. But Rowan had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. It was one of the things his ex-wife had complained about, his need to understand everything, to dig into problems until he found their roots. And this was a problem that went deeper than just a strange experience on a dark highway. 4 men had disappeared 17 years ago, leaving behind families who never got closure. A dispatcher had been traumatized by whatever she'd heard on the radio that night. And now, apparently, other drivers were encountering the same phenomenon, hearing the same voices, seeing the same impossible trucks. If there was any chance of understanding what was happening, any possibility of finding answers that might bring peace to the families of the missing drivers or prevent future incidents, then Rowan felt obligated to pursue it. Even if it meant driving himself crazy, even if it meant becoming part of the stories that other drivers whispered about late at night. The lights of Deadhorse grew brighter as he approached. The settlement was less a town than an industrial camp, a collection of buildings and equipment yards serving the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. There was no permanent civilian population, just rotating shifts of workers and the occasional trucker making deliveries. It was as far north as you could drive in North America, the literal end of the road. Rowan made his delivery just after 7 in the morning, as the sky was beginning to show the first hints of the brief twilight that passed for daylight this far north in December. He had a few hours to rest before he needed to start the long drive back south, and he spent that time in his sleeper berth trying to catch some sleep while his mind raced with questions. He dreamed of ice fog and phantom headlights, of voices on the radio calling out for help, of trucks that drove endlessly through darkness without ever reaching their destination. In his dream, he was outside his truck at mile marker 294, standing on the frozen road while the aurora borealis danced overhead in shades of green and purple. The convoy approached from the south, 4 trucks running together, their headlights cutting through the fog. As they drew closer, Rowan could see the drivers through the windshields. Einar Holt in the lead truck, his weathered face set in concentration as he navigated the treacherous road. 3 other men in the trucks behind him, all of them focused on driving, all of them unaware that they were dead. that they'd been dead for 17 years. The trucks passed Rowan without slowing, and as the last one went by, the driver turned to look at him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that moment Rowan saw something that chilled him more than the Arctic cold. The driver knew. He knew he was dead. He knew he was trapped. And the expression on his face was one of pure, desperate terror. Rowan woke with a gasp, his heart pounding, his sleeping bag soaked with sweat despite the cold. He checked his watch and found that he'd been asleep for less than an hour, but it felt like he'd been dreaming for days. The image of that driver's face, the knowledge and terror in his eyes, was burned into Rowan's memory. He couldn't stay in Deadhorse. He needed to get back on the road, needed to drive south to Fairbanks and find Mara Ellison. She was the key to understanding what had happened at mile marker 294. She was the last person to hear the voices of those doomed drivers, and if anyone could tell him what was really going on, it would be her. Rowan started his engine and began the long drive back south. It was mid-morning now, and the sky had lightened to a deep blue twilight that would last for a few hours before fading back into complete darkness. The road looked different in the half-light, less ominous, but no less dangerous. Ice still coated the surface, and wind was beginning to pick up, pushing his trailer around on the curves. He drove in silence, his CB radio off, not wanting to risk hearing those voices again until he had more information. The miles rolled by beneath his wheels, each one taking him closer to Fairbanks and whatever answers Mara Ellison might be able to provide. As he approached mile marker 294 from the north, around 2 in the afternoon, Rowan slowed his truck and pulled over onto the shoulder. He needed to see the place in daylight, needed to understand what made this particular spot so significant. The twilight was beginning to fade, but there was still enough light to see the surrounding area. There was nothing remarkable about it. Just another stretch of the Dalton Highway, with ice-covered pavement and snowbanks on either side. No buildings, no landmarks, nothing that would distinguish it from any other mile of the 400-mile road. But as Rowan sat there in his idling truck, watching the light fade and the darkness return, he felt something. A presence, a wrongness, a sense that this place existed slightly out of phase with the rest of reality, as if the fabric of the world had been torn here and never properly healed. He pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the area, knowing they probably wouldn't show anything unusual, but feeling compelled to document it anyway. Then he got back on the road and continued south, driving faster now, eager to put distance between himself and that haunted stretch of highway. By the time he reached Coldfoot for his second fuel stop, full darkness had returned. Sarah Kincaid was still behind the counter, working what must have been a double shift. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd expected him to come back. "You going to see her?" she asked without preamble. "Mara Ellison, yeah. I need to know what she heard that night." Sarah nodded slowly. "When you talk to her, you be gentle. What happened broke something in her. She's put her life back together since then, but it's a fragile thing. Don't go digging up the past unless you're prepared to deal with what you find." "I'll be careful," Rowan promised. "But I have to know. I have to understand what's happening out there." "Understanding and accepting are two different things," Sarah said. "You might find that the truth is worse than not knowing." Rowan thought about the dream he'd had, about the terror in that driver's eyes. "I'll take that risk." He drove through the night toward Fairbanks, the city lights growing brighter on the southern horizon as he descended from the Brooks Range. Somewhere behind him, mile marker 294 sat in the frozen darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, 4 trucks were still driving, still searching for a destination they would never reach, still calling out on the radio for help that was 17 years too late. Rowan reached Fairbanks just before dawn on his second day without real sleep. The city lights felt almost aggressive after so many hours in the polar darkness, and he had to squint against the brightness of the streetlights and storefront signs. He found a truck stop on the south side of town, parked his rig, and spent an hour in the shower trying to wash away the exhaustion and the lingering sense of wrongness that had followed him down from the north slope. He'd called ahead to the repair shop that Sarah Kincaid had mentioned, and a recorded message told him they opened at 8 in the morning. That gave him 2 hours to grab breakfast and figure out what he was going to say to a woman who'd spent 17 years trying to forget the worst night of her life. The diner attached to the truck stop was busy with the morning shift change from the nearby military base. Rowan sat in a booth by the window, drinking coffee that was better than anything he'd had at Coldfoot, and watched the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray that passed for daylight this far north in December. The sun wouldn't actually rise for another few weeks, but the extended twilight was a welcome change from the absolute darkness of the highway. At 7:45, he drove his truck to the address Sarah had given him. Arctic Air Repair was located in an industrial area near the airport, a squat metal building with a small office attached to a larger workshop. Several small aircraft engines were visible through the open bay doors, and he could hear the sound of pneumatic tools from inside the shop. The office was warm and cluttered with parts catalogs and maintenance logs. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s, wearing coveralls and safety glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had short gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of Alaska living. When she looked up at Rowan, her eyes were sharp and assessing. "Help you with something?" she asked. Her voice was polite but guarded, the tone of someone who'd learned to be cautious with strangers. "Are you Mara Ellison?" Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around her eyes that told Rowan she was already preparing to shut down whatever conversation he was about to start. "Depends on who's asking and why." Rowan took a breath. "My name is Rowan Kincaid. I'm a trucker. I drive the Dalton Highway regularly, hauling loads up to Deadhorse. 2 nights ago, I had an experience at mile marker 294 that I can't explain, and Sarah Kincaid suggested I talk to you about it." Mara's face went pale. She set down the wrench she'd been holding and gripped the counter with both hands. "Sarah sent you here?" "She said you were the dispatcher for Northern Freight Services back in 2006. She said you were on the radio with Einar Holt and the other drivers the night they disappeared." "I don't talk about that," Mara said, but her voice had lost its strength. "I haven't talked about it in 17 years, and I'm not starting now." "I heard you on the CB radio," Rowan said quickly, before she could shut him down completely. "Night before last, around midnight. You warned me about the convoy, told me not to let them catch up to me. You said your name was Mara Ellison, and that you'd been trying to warn other drivers." Mara stared at him for a long moment, and Rowan watched a series of emotions play across her face. Disbelief, fear, and then something that looked like desperate hope. "That's impossible. I wasn't on any radio 2 nights ago. I don't even own a CB anymore. I know it sounds crazy, but I heard your voice as clearly as I'm hearing it now. You told me about the convoy being trapped in a loop, about them not knowing they were dead. You told me that the polar night creates conditions where reality gets thin." Mara's hands were shaking now. She moved around the counter and flipped the sign on the door to closed, then locked it. "Come with me," she said, and led him through the workshop to a small break room in the back. She poured them both coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there for hours, and sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Rowan told her the whole story. The voices on the CB, the convoy that appeared behind him, Einar Holt's name. her warning. The way the trucks had faded away at mile marker 294. He told her about his stop at Coldfoot and his conversation with Sarah Kincaid, about the other drivers who'd reported similar experiences. When he finished, Mara was staring into her coffee cup, her jaw clenched tight. "What I'm about to tell you," she said finally, "I've never told anyone. Not the police, not the investigators, not even Sarah. Because if I'd told them the truth, they would have thought I was insane. Hell, I thought I was insane for years afterward." She took a long drink of coffee and continued. "That night in 2006, I was working dispatch from the Northern Freight Office in Fairbanks. It was December 15th, polar night, and we had a convoy of 4 trucks running north to Deadhorse. Einar Holt was the lead driver, and he had 3 others with him. They'd left Fairbanks around 4 in the afternoon, planning to make Deadhorse by early morning." Rowan nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Everything was routine for the first few hours. They checked in at regular intervals, reported road conditions, the usual stuff. But around midnight, when they were approaching mile marker 294, Einar came on the radio and said they were having engine trouble. One of the trucks was losing power, and they were going to pull over to check it out. That's what I heard on my CB," Rowan said. Almost word for word. Maris's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I told them to be careful, to stick together, to call back if they needed me to send help. Then there was silence for maybe 10 minutes. I wasn't worried at first. Engine trouble takes time to diagnose, and they were experienced drivers who knew what they were doing." She paused, and Rowan could see her struggling with what came next. Then Einar came back on the radio, and his voice was different, scared. He said there was something moving in the ice fog around the trucks. At first, they thought it was another driver who'd stopped to help, but when they shined their flashlights on it, they realized it wasn't human. He said the shape was wrong. The proportions were off, like someone had built a person but didn't quite get the details right. The hair on Rowan's arm stood up. "What did you tell them?" "I told them to get back in their trucks and get out of there. But Einar said the thing was between them and their cabs. He said it was just standing there in the fog, not moving, but they couldn't get past it. And then one of the other drivers, a kid named Bryson, he started shouting that there were more of them, that they were surrounded." Mara's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was shouting into the radio, telling them to run, to get to their trucks any way they could. But then I heard this sound. It came through the radio so clearly that I felt it in my bones. It was like wind and static and something else, something that sounded almost like words, but in a language I didn't recognize. And underneath it all was this tone, this low frequency that made my head hurt and my vision blur." She stopped and took several deep breaths before continuing. "The drivers were screaming, all 4 of them at once. I could hear them clearly even over that other sound. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then everything went silent. The trucks were still transmitting. I could hear the engines idling, but there was no one talking. I stayed on the radio all night, calling for them, begging them to answer. But there was nothing." Rowan felt cold, despite the warmth of the break room. "The search teams found the trucks the next morning?" "Yeah, all 4 of them parked on the shoulder at mile marker 294, engines still running, doors open, but no sign of the drivers. No footprints in the snow except the ones leading from the trucks to where they'd been standing. It was like they just vanished into thin air." Mara looked up at Rowan with haunted eyes. "But that's not the strangest part." "What's the strangest part?" "The strangest part is that I heard them again. 3 months later, I was still working dispatch, even though I probably shouldn't have been. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was monitoring the radio out of habit more than anything else. And then I heard Einar's voice, clear as day, saying they were approaching mile marker 290 with 4 rigs running heavy through the ice fog. Rowan's stomach dropped. The same transmission you heard the first night. Not exactly the same, but close enough. It was like he was making the same run, having the same conversation, heading toward the same destination. I tried to respond, tried to warn him about what was going to happen, but he couldn't hear me. Or maybe he could hear me, but I was the one out of time, trying to send a message backward to a moment that had already happened. "You warned me," Rowan said. "I heard you on my CB 2 nights ago. You told me not to let them catch up to me." Mara shook her head slowly. "I didn't transmit anything 2 nights ago. But that doesn't mean you didn't hear me. Time works differently at mile marker 294. The past and present overlap there. I think when I tried to warn Einar all those years ago, when I was shouting into the radio trying to save him, my voice somehow got caught in that place. And now, when conditions are right, when another driver passes through at the right time, they can hear the warnings I was sending back then." "That's insane," Rowan said. But he was thinking about the dream he'd had in Dead Horse, about the driver who'd looked at him with knowing terror in his eyes. "But it's the only explanation that fits what I experienced." "I've thought about it for 17 years, Mara said. Tried to make sense of it using every framework I could think of. Science, religion, folklore, psychology. The only conclusion I keep coming back to is that there are places in the world where the normal rules don't apply, where the darkness and isolation and extreme conditions create weak spots in reality. And mile marker 294 is one of those places." "What do you think happened to them?" Rowan asked. "Where did they go?" "I don't know. But I'll tell you what I think. I think they're still there, trapped in the moment of their disappearance, driving the same route over and over without realizing that time has moved on. I think they're caught in a loop that they can't break free from, and everyone they try to contact, everyone who hears them on the radio, exists in a future they can't reach." Rowan thought about this for a moment. But if they're trapped in the past, why do they keep appearing to other drivers? Why do people keep encountering them? "Because the loop isn't perfect," Mara said. "It's degrading, breaking down, and every time it cycles through, it bleeds over a little more into our present. That's why more drivers have been reporting encounters in recent years. The barrier between their time and ours is getting thinner. Is there any way to help them? To break the loop?" Mara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with regret. "I don't know. I've thought about it constantly, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have saved them. But the truth is, I don't think anyone can help them now. They're beyond our reach, trapped in a moment that keeps repeating, and the only thing we can do is try to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. How do we do that? By warning other drivers. By making sure people know that mile marker 294 is dangerous, especially during polar night when the conditions are right for the past to bleed through. By telling them that if they hear voices on the CB claiming to be a convoy, if they see lights behind them that don't behave the way normal headlights should, they need to get away from that area as fast as they can." Rowan pulled out his phone and showed Mara the photographs he'd taken of mile marker 294. "Does anything about this location look significant to you? Any reason why it would be a weak spot?" Mara studied the photographs carefully. "I've been to that spot a dozen times over the years, trying to understand what makes it different. There's nothing obvious. No ancient burial grounds, no history of accidents or deaths before 2006. It's just another mile of highway through the Brooks Range. But you think the polar night has something to do with it?" "I think the polar night creates the conditions, but there has to be something else. Some combination of factors that only comes together in that specific location at that specific time. The darkness, the cold, the isolation, the magnetic fields from the aurora, something in the geology of the area. All of it working together to create a place where reality is thinner than it should be. She handed the phone back to Rowan. You know what the worst part is? Knowing that Einar and the others might still be conscious in there. They might be aware that they're trapped, aware that they keep making the same drive over and over, but unable to break free or to understand what's happened to them. That's the nightmare that keeps me awake at night. Rowan thought about his dream again, about the terror in that driver's eyes. I think you're right. I think they know. Then we have to make sure no one else gets trapped with them, Mara said firmly. That's the only thing we can do for them now. Make sure their fate doesn't become someone else's reality. They talked for another hour, comparing notes on what Rowan had experienced and what Mara had heard that night in 2006. The details matched too closely to be coincidence, and by the end of the conversation, both of them were convinced that something genuinely inexplicable was happening at mile marker 294. As Rowan was getting ready to leave, Mara stopped him at the door. One more thing. If you keep driving the Dalton, if you pass through that area again during polar night, be careful. The fact that you heard both the convoy and my warning means you're sensitive to whatever's happening there. That makes you more vulnerable than other drivers. You might be able to hear things they can't, see things they miss, and that means you're at greater risk of getting pulled into the loop. I'll be careful, Rowan promised. But I can't just avoid that stretch of highway. It's part of my route, part of my job. Then make sure you never stop there. Never pull over between mile markers 290 and 295. And if you hear voices on the CB that sound like they might be the convoy, switch channels immediately. Don't engage with them. Don't try to help them. Just get as far away as possible. Rowan nodded and headed back to his truck. The sun still hadn't risen, and wouldn't rise for weeks yet, but the sky had lightened to a pale twilight that made the world feel slightly less oppressive. He sat in his cab for a few minutes, processing everything Mara had told him, and tried to decide what to do next. He could take Mara's advice and avoid mile marker 294 during polar night. He could change his route, refuse loads that required him to drive the Dalton in December and January. It would hurt his income, but it would keep him safe from whatever was trapped at that location. Or he could keep driving, keep passing through that haunted stretch of highway, and hope that he never encountered the convoy again. In the end, the decision was made for him. His dispatcher called with another load heading north to Deadhorse, pickup that afternoon, delivery in 2 days. It was good money, and Rowan needed good money. More than that, he felt a strange obligation to keep driving that road, to bear witness to what had happened to Einar Holt and the others, to make sure their story didn't fade into forgotten legend. He accepted the load and started the long drive back down to the warehouse district to pick up his trailer. As he drove through Fairbanks, he thought about what Mara had said about reality being thin in certain places during polar night. He thought about the convoy trapped in their endless loop, and about his own vulnerability to whatever forces were at work at mile marker 294. But mostly, he thought about the responsibility that came with knowledge. He knew now what had happened to those 4 drivers, or at least as much as anyone could know. He understood that they were trapped in a moment that kept repeating, that they were beyond help, that the best thing anyone could do was stay away from the place where they'd vanished. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that somewhere in the details of what had happened that night in 2006, there was a key to understanding not just how the drivers had disappeared, but why. And maybe, just maybe, a way to free them from their endless loop through the frozen darkness. He picked up his trailer and headed north once again, back toward the Dalton Highway and the long drive through polar night. The darkness was waiting for him, absolute and patient, and somewhere in that darkness, 4 ghost trucks were still driving, still searching for a destination they would never reach. Rowan switched on his CB radio and tuned it to channel 19. For now, the airwaves were silent except for the crackle of static. But he knew that silence wouldn't last. Sooner or later, probably sooner, he would hear those voices again. The convoy calling out for help across a gap of 17 years, and Mara's warning trying to reach him from the past. He just had to make sure that when he heard them, he was strong enough to resist the pull of that haunted place. Strong enough to keep driving, to stay in his own time, to avoid becoming another voice calling out from the darkness for help that would never come. The road stretched out ahead of him, disappearing into the twilight, and Rowan pressed down on the accelerator. There were miles to cover before darkness fell completely, and he wanted to be as far north as possible before the polar night swallowed the highway once again, before he had to drive past mile marker 294 and face whatever was waiting for him there in the frozen dark. The second time Rowan drove north through mile marker 294, it was 3 days after his conversation with Mara Ellison. The polar night had deepened, if that was even possible, and the temperature had dropped to 42 below zero. Ice fog hung thick across the Brooks Range, reducing visibility to almost nothing for long stretches of highway. It was the kind of night when smart drivers stayed in Fairbanks and waited for better conditions. Rowan kept his CB radio on, but switched between channels randomly, never staying on any frequency long enough for voices from the past to find him. He'd debated turning it off completely, but that seemed more dangerous than the alternative. If he broke down or encountered trouble, the CB was his only reliable lifeline to other drivers who might be able to help. He reached mile marker 290 around 11 at night. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he checked his mirrors for any sign of headlights behind him. The road was empty, nothing but darkness and swirling ice fog. He increased his speed slightly, wanting to get through the danger zone as quickly as possible without losing control on the icy surface. Mile marker 291 passed. Then 292. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and he realized he was holding his breath. The cab felt too warm suddenly, despite the Arctic cold pressing against the windows. Sweat trickled down his back underneath his layers of clothing. At mile marker 293, his CB crackled to life. Northbound convoy, approaching mile marker 290. It was Einar Holt's voice, the same transmission Rowan had heard on his first encounter. But this time he didn't respond. He reached for the CB and switched it off completely, cutting the voice off mid-sentence. The sudden silence in the cab was almost worse than the static. Mile marker 294 appeared in his headlights. Rowan kept his foot steady on the accelerator, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in his mirrors. He could feel something, though, a presence pressing against the back of his truck, a weight that had nothing to do with the cargo in his trailer. The temperature inside the cab dropped suddenly, and his breath came out in white clouds despite the heater running at full blast. Then he was past it. Mile marker 295 flashed by, and the oppressive feeling lifted as abruptly as it had arrived. The temperature in the cab returned to normal, and Rowan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He'd made it through. He'd resisted the pull of that haunted place and stayed in his own time. But the relief lasted only a few seconds. In his mirror, he saw them. 4 sets of headlights much closer than they should have been. The convoy had somehow caught up to him despite his speed, despite the fact that they shouldn't exist in his present moment at all. They were maintaining a steady distance of maybe a quarter mile behind him, matching his speed exactly, following him north into the darkness. Rowan's first instinct was to accelerate, to try to outrun them. But something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the same sense of obligation that had brought him back to this highway in the first place. Instead of speeding up, he maintained his current pace and watched the ghost trucks in his mirrors. They stayed with him for the next 40 miles, never getting closer, never falling back. Just 4 sets of headlights maintaining perfect formation, driving through the polar night toward a destination they would never reach. Rowan found himself thinking about the drivers trapped in those trucks. Einar Holt and the 3 others whose names he'd never learned. Were they aware of him? Did they know they were following a living driver through the darkness? Or were they too lost in their own loop to notice anything outside of it? Around mile marker 35, the convoy began to fade. The headlights grew dimmer, less substantial, until they looked more like reflections on ice than actual lights. By mile marker 340, they were gone completely, leaving Rowan alone on the highway once again. He drove the rest of the way to Deadhorse in silence, his CB still switched off, his mind churning with questions he couldn't answer. He'd escaped the pull of mile marker 294, but the convoy had still found him. They'd followed him for 40 miles beyond their anchor point, which according to Mara's theory shouldn't have been possible. Either the loop was expanding, or the rules that governed it were more complex than anyone had understood. After making his delivery in Deadhorse, Rowan tried to sleep but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those headlights in his mirrors, following him through the darkness. He kept thinking about what Mara had said about being sensitive to the phenomenon, about being at greater risk of getting pulled into the loop. Maybe his first encounter had created some kind of connection between him and the trapped convoy. Maybe they could sense him now, could find him anywhere on the Dalton Highway regardless of time or distance. The drive back south began in the late afternoon twilight. Rowan had planned his timing carefully, hoping to pass through mile marker 294 during the few hours of dim daylight. He figured that whatever forces were at work there might be weaker when the darkness wasn't absolute. It was a theory without any evidence to support it, but it made him feel slightly more in control of the situation. As he approached the Brooks Range from the north, he noticed something strange about the sky. The aurora borealis was visible even in the twilight, which was unusual. Great sheets of green and purple light rippled across the heavens, brighter and more active than he'd ever seen them. The radio in his truck picked up heavy static from the electromagnetic interference, and his GPS flickered in and out of signal. Mile marker 295 came into view around 4 in the afternoon. The twilight was already beginning to fade, darkness creeping back across the landscape like a tide. Rowan kept his speed steady and his eyes on the road. He'd decided to keep his CB radio off for this passage, not wanting to risk hearing anything that might distract him or pull him into engagement with the convoy. But as he passed mile marker 294, heading south this time, something happened that no amount of preparation could have prevented. His truck died. Not the engine sputtering or failing gradually, but a complete and instantaneous shutdown. The engine cut out. The lights went dark. The heater stopped blowing. Even his dashboard instruments went dead. The truck coasted to a stop right at mile marker 294, momentum carrying it onto the shoulder before the wheels locked up on the icy surface. Rowan sat in the sudden silence and darkness, his breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was something else. Something that had reached out from that haunted place and dragged him to a stop at the exact location where 4 drivers had disappeared 17 years ago. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Tried his phone. Dead. Tried his emergency flashlight. The batteries were fresh, but it wouldn't turn on. Every piece of electrical equipment in his truck had been drained of power simultaneously. Outside, the twilight had faded to full darkness. The aurora borealis danced overhead, casting strange shadows across the ice fog that swirled around his truck. Rowan stared through his windshield at the darkness beyond his hood and tried to fight down the panic rising in his chest. He couldn't stay in the truck. Without the engine running, without the heater, the temperature in the cab would drop to lethal levels within an hour. But the alternative was getting out and trying to fix the problem in 40 below zero weather, in the dark, at the exact spot where 4 other drivers had vanished. The smart thing to do was wait. Eventually, another truck would come by and see him stopped on the shoulder. They'd call for help, and a tow truck would come from Coldfoot. He just had to survive in the cold until then. But as Rowan sat there in the darkness, trying to convince himself to stay put, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Someone was walking around his truck, heavy boots crunching on the packed snow beside the highway. Slow, deliberate steps that circled from the passenger side toward the front of his cab. Rowan pressed his face against the driver's side window, trying to see who was out there. The aurora light was too dim and too flickering to make out details, but he could see a shape moving through the ice fog. A person, or something like a person, approaching his door. The footsteps stopped right outside his window. Rowan held his breath and waited. A hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide. In the green light of the aurora, Rowan could see that the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at angles that human bones couldn't achieve. Then a face appeared at the window. It was Einar Holt. Rowan recognized him from the photographs he'd seen at the memorial service years ago, from the newspaper articles about the disappearance. But something was wrong with his features. The skin was too pale, almost translucent. The eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, and when Einar's mouth opened, no breath fogged the glass despite the extreme cold. "Help us," Einar said, his voice muffled by the window but still clearly audible. "We can't find the road. We've been driving for so long, but we can never reach Dead Horse. Please help us." Rowan wanted to look away, wanted to hide, but he found himself unable to break eye contact with those black, empty eyes. "You're dead," he managed to say. "You disappeared 17 years ago." "No." Einar shook his head slowly. "No, we just left Fairbanks tonight. It's December 15th, 2006. We're having engine trouble and we need help. You're a driver, you understand. We take care of each other on this highway." "It's not 2006, Rowan said. "It's 23. You've been gone for 17 years. Something flickered in Einar's expression. Confusion, then a flash of what might have been recognition or horror. "That's not right. That can't be right. We just started this run. We're going to make Dead Horse by morning." "You're never going to reach Dead Horse," Rowan said, and felt terrible for saying it. "You're trapped here. You have been since the night you disappeared. You keep driving the same route over and over, but you never get where you're going." Einar's hand pressed harder against the window, and Rowan heard the glass crack slightly under the pressure. "You're lying. You're trying to confuse us. We need help with our trucks, that's all. Just help us, and we'll be on our way." "I can't help you," Rowan said. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." More footsteps now, coming from different directions. The other 3 drivers were approaching his truck, surrounding it. Rowan could see their shapes moving through the ice fog, their proportions just as wrong as Einar's, their movements just slightly off from human normal. "Get out of your truck," Einar said, and his voice had changed. It was colder now, more insistent. "Get out and help us. We're all drivers. We help each other. That's the code." "I can't get out, Rowan," Nasha said. "If I get out, I'll end up like you." "Then you'll have company," Einar replied. "You'll understand what it's like. The darkness that never ends. The road that goes nowhere. The cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. You'll drive with us forever, and maybe together we can find our way to Dead Horse. The other 3 drivers were at his windows now, pressing their hands against the glass, their faces appearing in the dim aurora light. All of them had the same wrong proportions, the same black eyes, the same pale skin. All of them were speaking at once, their voices overlapping into a chorus of pleading and demands. Help us. Get out of your truck. We need you. Join us. You're one of us. Driver helps driver. The road never ends. The darkness never breaks. Rowan closed his eyes and pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the voices. He thought about Mara Ellison, about her warning that he was vulnerable to the pull of this place. He thought about the 4 drivers who'd gotten out of their trucks 17 years ago and been taken by something that lurked in the ice fog and darkness. But most of all, he thought about what it would mean to join them, to become trapped in an endless loop, driving the same highway night after night, never reaching his destination, never understanding that time had moved on without him. That was worse than death. That was a special kind of hell designed specifically for truck drivers, for people whose entire lives were built around movement and purpose and reaching the next destination. No, he said out loud, opening his eyes. I'm not getting out. I'm staying in my truck until help arrives. The voices stopped abruptly. The hands pressed against his windows fell away. The shapes in the ice fog retreated slightly, and for a moment, Rowan thought they were leaving. Then Einar spoke again, and his voice had changed completely. It was no longer trying to sound human. It was something else, something that had been using Einar's face and voice like a mask. You can't stay in there forever. Eventually you'll run out of air, or the cold will take you, or you'll simply give up and come out. And when you do, we'll be waiting. We've been waiting for 17 years. We can wait 17 more. The shapes faded back into the darkness, but Rowan knew they hadn't gone far. They were still out there, circling his truck, patient and persistent. And the terrible thing was that the voice was right. He couldn't stay in the cab indefinitely. Eventually, he would have to make a choice. He tried his phone again. Still dead. Tried the ignition. Nothing. Checked every electrical system in his truck and found them all completely drained. Whatever force had stopped his vehicle had been thorough. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. The temperature in the cab dropped steadily. Rowan put on every piece of clothing he had, wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, and tried to conserve body heat. But 42 below zero was relentless, and without the heater running, he knew he was in serious danger of hypothermia. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 45 minutes, Rowan saw headlights approaching from the south. Another truck, a real truck from his own time, was heading north on the highway. He grabbed his emergency flare gun from the storage compartment behind his seat and found that it still worked. He fired a flare through the slightly cracked window, sending a bright red star arcing into the sky. The approaching truck slowed and pulled over behind him. Rowan watched in his mirror as a driver climbed down from the cab and approached through the ice fog. This person moved normally, human proportions, human gait. When the driver reached Rowan's window and shined a flashlight inside, Rowan saw an older man with a gray beard and concerned eyes. "You okay in there?" the man shouted through the glass. "Electrical system's dead," Rowan shouted back. "Everything shut down at once. Can you call for a tow truck?" The man nodded and pulled out a satellite phone. While he was making the call, Rowan glanced around at the darkness beyond the truck. He could still see them out there. The 4 shapes standing in the ice fog, watching. The other driver couldn't see them, or maybe they weren't visible to him at all. "Tow trucks coming from Coldfoot," the man said when he returned to Rowan's window. "Should be here in about 90 minutes. You need to sit in my cab where it's warm. You'll freeze to death in there." Rowan was tempted. The cold was becoming unbearable, and his fingers and toes were starting to go numb despite his layers of clothing. But getting out of his truck meant walking through the darkness where those things were waiting. "I'll be okay," he said. "Just stay here with me until the tow truck arrives." The older driver looked skeptical, but nodded. "I'll keep my truck running right behind you. If you change your mind, just signal and I'll come get you." For the next 90 minutes, Rowan sat in his freezing cab and watched the shapes in the darkness. They never approached the other driver, never made themselves known to anyone except Rowan. And gradually, as the time passed and the tow truck drew closer, they began to fade. By the time the tow truck arrived with its flashing yellow lights and rumbling diesel engine, the convoy was gone completely. The mechanic who examined Rowan's truck couldn't explain what had happened. Every electrical system had been drained simultaneously, which shouldn't have been possible. The batteries were completely dead, not just low, but actually damaged, as if they'd been subjected to a massive electromagnetic pulse. The electronics would all need to be replaced. They towed Rowan's truck back to Coldfoot, and he spent 3 days there while repairs were made. During that time, he talked to other drivers about their experiences on the Dalton Highway. Most of them had stories about strange encounters, unexplained phenomena, moments when the road seemed to exist outside of normal reality. But none of them had experienced anything quite as direct as what had happened to Rowan. On his 4th day in Coldfoot, Sarah Kincaid pulled him aside during breakfast. "I heard what happened at 294, she said quietly. "Word travels fast among drivers up here. I saw your brother-in-law," Rowan told her, "or something wearing his face. He tried to get me to leave my truck." Sarah nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected for years. "He's not the man I knew anymore. Whatever's out there at that mile marker, it took Einar and the others and turned them into something else. They're trapped between life and death, between past and present, and they want company. They want other drivers to join them so they don't have to be alone in that endless darkness." "How do I make sure it doesn't happen again?" Rowan asked. "You can't," Sarah replied simply. "If you keep driving this highway, especially during polar night, you're going to encounter them again. That first contact created a connection, and now they know you. They'll find you every time you pass through their territory." "So, I should stop driving the Dalton?" Sarah considered this for a moment. "That's up to you. But I'll tell you this. Running away doesn't always work. This highway gets into your blood. It becomes part of who you are. And even if you never drive it again, you'll dream about it. You'll wonder what's happening up here in the darkness. Sometimes facing your fear is the only way to live with it." When Rowan's truck was finally repaired, he had a decision to make. He could refuse loads heading north, could stick to routes that kept him away from the Dalton Highway and the thing that waited at mile marker 294. Or he could keep driving, keep facing the convoy, and hope that he was strong enough to resist their call. He chose to keep driving, not because he was brave, but because Sarah was right. The highway had gotten into his blood, and more than that, he felt a responsibility to bear witness to what had happened to Einar Holt and the others. Someone needed to remember them, needed to tell their story, needed to warn other drivers about the danger that lurked in the polar night. In the months that followed, Rowan made 7 more runs to Deadhorse during the winter darkness. Each time he passed mile marker 294, he encountered the convoy. Sometimes they were just lights in his mirror, following him for a few miles before fading away. Other times, they were more aggressive, surrounding his truck, calling to him on the CB radio despite it being turned off, appearing at his windows with their wrong faces and their desperate pleas. But he never stopped, never got out of his truck, never let them pull him into their endless loop. Other drivers started reporting similar encounters. Word spread through the trucking community about the haunted stretch of highway, about the ghost convoy that appeared during polar night. Some drivers refused to run the Dalton between November and January. Others, like Rowan, kept driving but took precautions. They traveled in groups when possible, carried extra emergency equipment, and most importantly, they never stopped between mile markers 290 and 295. Mara Ellison called him once, about 6 months after their first meeting. She'd heard about his repeated encounters with the convoy and wanted to know if he'd learned anything new. "They're degrading," Rowan told her. "Each time I see them, they're less human, more desperate. The loop is breaking down, and they're breaking down with it." "What do you think will happen when it finally collapses completely?" Mara asked. "I don't know," Rowan admitted. "Maybe they'll finally be free, or maybe they'll be trapped in an even worse way, scattered across time and space with no coherent form at all. There's no way to know." "Are you afraid?" "Every time I drive past that place," Rowan said honestly. "Every single time. But I keep driving anyway because someone has to. Someone has to remember what happened there and make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Years have passed since Rowan's first encounter with the convoy. He still drives the Dalton Highway, still makes regular runs to Dead Horse during the polar night. The convoy still appears, still follows him, still tries to convince him to join them in their endless journey. But Rowan has learned something important about the darkness and the things that live in it. Fear is not something you conquer. It's something you learn to carry with you, to live alongside, to respect without letting it control you. The convoy will always be out there at mile marker 294, trapped in their loop, calling out for help and company. And Rowan will always be vulnerable to their pull, will always feel that cold presence pressing against his truck as he passes through their territory. That's the price of driving the Dalton Highway during polar night. That's the cost of working in a place where darkness rules for months at a time, and reality grows thin under the weight of isolation and cold. Some mysteries can't be solved. Some horrors can't be defeated. You just learn to live with them, to acknowledge their existence, and to make sure you never let your guard down. Late at night, when Rowan is parked at a truck stop hundreds of miles from the Brooks Range, he sometimes thinks about Einar Holt and the 3 other drivers whose names he still doesn't know. He wonders if they're aware of what they've become, if they remember their lives before they got trapped in that frozen moment. He wonders if they hate him for refusing to join them, or if some small part of them is grateful that he's resisted, that he hasn't added another voice to their chorus of the lost. He'll never know the answers to those questions. All he can do is keep driving, keep bearing witness, and keep warning other drivers about the danger that waits in the darkness. Because that's what drivers do for each other. They share information about road conditions and hazards. They warn each other about dangers ahead. They look out for one another in the loneliest places, even when those dangers are ghosts from the past, trapped in an endless loop through the polar night, forever searching for a destination they'll never reach. The road goes on. The darkness returns every winter. And at mile marker 294 on the Dalton Highway, 4 trucks are still driving, still calling out on Channel 19, still hoping that someday, somehow, they'll finally make it to Dead Horse before the sun comes up. Amos Reddick had been driving the ice roads of the Northwest Territories for 6 years, and he'd learned to read the weather like other men read newspapers. The way the wind shifted direction, the texture of the clouds, the quality of the cold, all of it told a story if you knew how to listen. And tonight, as he pushed his Peterbilt north along the Dempster Highway toward Enovik, every sign he could read was telling him the same thing. A major storm was coming, and it was coming fast. It was early January, deep into the polar night, and the thermometer on his dashboard read minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The darkness up here was absolute, broken only by his headlights cutting through the crystalline air and the occasional shimmer of aurora borealis dancing across the northern sky. The Dempster Highway was one of the most remote roads in North America, 450 miles of gravel and ice connecting Yukon to the Arctic Ocean, and in winter it became something close to another planet. Amos had left Dawson City 12 hours earlier with a load of mining equipment destined for one of the operations near Inuvik. It should have been a straightforward run, 30 hours of driving broken up by mandatory rest stops, nothing he hadn't done dozens of times before. But the weather forecast had changed 3 times since he'd started out, each update more ominous than the last. What had begun as a prediction of light snow had evolved into warnings of a major Arctic front moving in faster than expected, bringing with it blizzard conditions and wind chills that could kill an exposed person in minutes. He'd passed the last settlement, a tiny place called Eagle Plains, about 2 hours ago. The hotel there had offered him a room to wait out the storm, but Amos had checked his fuel gauge and his cargo deadline and made the calculation that he could beat the worst of it if he pushed hard. Now, watching the wind pick up and the first fat snowflakes beginning to spiral down from the black sky, he was starting to regret that decision. The CB radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. He was too far from any other drivers to pick up conversations, and the storm was creating electromagnetic interference that made communication nearly impossible anyway. He switched through the channels out of habit, listening to the hiss and pop of dead air, and tried not to think about how alone he was out here. The snow began in earnest around midnight, and within 20 minutes visibility had dropped from a few hundred yards to barely 50 feet. Amos slowed his truck to a crawl, following the reflective markers at the edge of the road and praying he wouldn't hit a patch of overflow ice or drive into a drift. The wind had risen to a shriek that rocked his trailer back and forth, and he could feel his tires struggling for traction on the rapidly deteriorating surface. He was starting to seriously consider finding a place to pull over and wait out the storm when his fuel gauge caught his attention. He'd been so focused on driving that he hadn't noticed how much diesel he'd burned fighting through the wind and snow. The gauge showed less than a quarter tank, which in normal conditions would be plenty to reach Inuvik. But these weren't normal conditions. If he had to idle for hours waiting out a storm, or if the road conditions got worse and he had to fight for every mile, he might not make it. The smart thing to do was stop now while he still had fuel to keep his engine running and his cab warm. But stopping on the Dempster Highway in the middle of a blizzard, in polar night darkness, with temperatures approaching 50 below, was barely less dangerous than running out of fuel. He needed shelter, or at least a place where he could park safely away from the road so other vehicles wouldn't crash into him. As if in answer to his thoughts, his headlights picked out a sign emerging from the swirling snow. It was old and weathered, the paint faded almost to illegibility, but he could just make out the words, Northern Stop Station, Services, 2 miles. Amos frowned. He'd driven this route at least 30 times over the past 6 years, and he'd never seen that sign before. There were no truck stops between Eagle Plains and Inuvik, nothing but empty wilderness for more than 200 miles. But the sign was clearly there, and right now he didn't have the luxury of being suspicious about unexpected facilities. He followed the arrow on the sign onto what looked like a side road, though the snow had already covered any tracks or markings that might have indicated regular use. The surface was rougher than the main highway, and his truck bounced and lurched through drifts that were deeper than they should have been if this road saw regular traffic. But ahead, through the blowing snow, he could make out lights. The Northern Stop Station materialized from the storm like something from another era. It was a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central parking area, all of it covered in snow and ice that suggested months or even years of abandonment. But there were lights on in several of the windows, dim and flickering, but unmistakably real. A fuel island stood near the main building, its ancient pumps still standing though covered in frost and surrounded by drifts. Amos pulled his truck into the parking area and sat for a moment, engine idling, studying the scene. Something about this place felt wrong. The buildings were too old, the design too outdated for a facility that should still have power and lights. The parking area was completely empty, with no other vehicles visible, which was strange for a truck stop during a major storm when drivers should be seeking shelter. But the fuel gauge was still dropping. His reserve was limited, and the storm outside was getting worse by the minute. Whatever this place was, it offered shelter from the wind and snow, and possibly fuel if those ancient pumps still worked. He couldn't afford to be picky. He shut off his engine, gathered his winter gear, and climbed down from the cab. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and immediately frosting the exposed skin around his eyes and mouth. The wind was vicious, carrying snow that stung like thrown sand. He pulled his hood tight around his face and made his way toward the main building, fighting through drifts that came up to his knees. The door to the main building was unlocked, which should have been his first warning. No legitimate business in the Arctic left their doors unlocked during polar night. But Amos was cold and tired and worried about his fuel situation. So he pushed inside and let the door swing shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind. The interior of the building was even stranger than the exterior. It looked like a truck stop from the 1970s, with wood-paneled walls, orange vinyl seating, and fixtures that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The lights were on, but they flickered irregularly, as if powered by a generator that was struggling to maintain voltage. A layer of dust covered every surface, and the air had a stale quality that suggested no fresh ventilation in a very long time. But what drew Amos's attention most was the evidence of recent occupation. There were coffee cups on the counter, still half full, though the liquid inside had frozen solid. A meal sat on one of the tables, partially eaten, the food preserved by the cold but clearly abandoned mid-bite. A jacket hung on a hook by the door, dusted with frost, but looking like its owner had just stepped away for a moment. "Hello?" Amos called out, his voice sounding flat and strange in the cold air. "Anybody here?" No answer, just the hum of the struggling lights and the muffled howl of the storm outside. Amos moved deeper into the building, his boots leaving wet prints on the dusty floor. Behind the counter was a small office area with a desk, filing cabinets, and a logbook lying open. He picked up the logbook and examined it in the dim light. The entries were dated, but the most recent one that he could read was from November 17th, 1987, 36 years ago. He flipped through the pages, finding entry after entry from the mid to late 1980s. Records of fuel deliveries, truck arrivals and departures, maintenance notes, all of it written in neat handwriting that became increasingly frantic and disjointed as the entries progressed. The last few pages were almost illegible, filled with scratched-out words and phrases that didn't make sense. Something wrong with the road. Drivers not reaching destination. Can't leave. Tried 3 times. Road loops back. The darkness is wrong here. The final entry, dated November 17, 1987, was written in large, shaky letters. "Do not stay. This place is not right. It holds on to people. Hetty Gallows." Amos set the logbook down carefully, his heart rate accelerating. This wasn't just an abandoned truck stop. This was a place where something had gone very wrong, and whoever Hetty Gallows was, she'd tried to warn anyone who came after her. He should leave. Should get back in his truck, storm or no storm, fuel or no fuel, and get as far away from this place as possible. But the wind outside was still screaming, and when he looked through the window, He could barely see his truck through the blowing snow. Going back out there now, with limited fuel and no clear sense of which direction would lead him back to the main highway, could be suicide. He decided to explore the rest of the building, to see if there was anything useful, any clue about what had happened here. Maybe there was stored fuel he could use, or emergency supplies that would help him survive until the storm passed. The building extended back further than he'd expected. Beyond the main room was a small convenience store area, the shelves still stocked with products that looked decades out of date. Canned goods with labels he didn't recognize, motor oil in containers that weren't made anymore, magazines from the 1980s yellowed and brittle with age. Past that was a break room with a few cots and a small kitchen area. Here, too, were signs of interrupted activity. A pot sat on the electric stove, its contents frozen into a solid mass that might once have been soup. Cards were laid out on a table, as if someone had been in the middle of a game. A portable radio sat on the counter, its frequency dial frozen in place. Amos tried the radio, but it was dead. He checked the kitchen, looking for anything that might be useful, and found the refrigerator still humming quietly. When he opened it, he discovered food that looked relatively fresh, though the dates on the packaging were from 1987. Bread that should have been molded and decayed but instead looked like it had been purchased yesterday. Milk that should have been long spoiled but smelled fine when he carefully sniffed the container. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Food didn't stay preserved for 36 years just because it was cold. He continued his exploration, moving down a narrow hallway that led to what looked like sleeping quarters. 3 small rooms, each containing a bed, a dresser, and personal items that suggested the people who'd lived here had left in a hurry. Clothes still hung in the closets. Toiletries sat on the dressers. In one room, a book lay open on the bed, a bookmark placed as if the reader had intended to come back and finish it. But the most disturbing discovery was in the bathroom at the end of the hall. Written on the mirror in what looked like lipstick partially obscured by frost was a message. Bram Corwin tried to leave. His truck is still running. He is not in it. Amos backed away from the mirror, his breath coming faster now. The fear he'd been pushing down was rising up his throat, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to get out of this building and away from this place. He hurried back through the building toward the front entrance, no longer concerned with exploring or finding supplies. But when he reached the main room and looked out the window toward where he'd parked his truck, his stomach dropped. His truck was gone. The parking area was empty except for blowing snow and darkness. The tire tracks he'd made coming in had already been filled by the storm, and there was no sign that any vehicle had been there at all. Amos ran to the door and yanked it open, letting in a blast of Arctic air that nearly knocked him over. He stumbled out into the storm, fighting through the wind and snow to where he knew he'd parked his Peterbilt. But there was nothing there. No truck, no trailer, no tracks. Just empty space and swirling white. He turned in a circle, panic fully taking hold now, trying to spot his truck anywhere in the parking area. The lights from the building cast a dim glow through the storm, but beyond that circle of light was only impenetrable darkness and snow. "This isn't happening," he said out loud, his words immediately whipped away by the wind. "This isn't real." But it was real. His truck was gone, and he was stranded at an impossible truck stop that shouldn't exist, in the middle of a blizzard, in polar night darkness, with no way to call for help and no way to survive once the building's failing power finally gave out. He staggered back inside, slamming the door against the wind and leaning against it while he tried to think. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd gotten disoriented in the storm and gone to the wrong part of the parking area. Maybe his truck had been stolen, though that seemed absurd given the location and conditions. Or maybe, and this was the thought that terrified him most, maybe this place did what Hetty Gallows had warned about. Maybe it held on to people, and trucks and made them disappear. Amos forced himself to calm down and think logically. He needed to search the building more thoroughly, needed to find a working phone or radio, needed to understand what this place was and why it seemed frozen in time from 1987. And most importantly, he needed to find a way to get his truck back, or to get out of here before he became another warning scrawled on a mirror. He went back to the office and dug through the filing cabinets looking for anything that might explain the history of this place. Most of the files were routine business records, fuel receipts, and maintenance logs. But in the bottom drawer of the last cabinet, he found a folder marked Incident Reports that made his blood run cold. The folder contained dozens of handwritten reports, all dated between 1985 and 1987, all describing the same pattern. Trucks would arrive at the northern stop station during storms or in poor conditions. The drivers would spend the night or wait out weather. And when conditions improved and they tried to leave, they found that the road leading back to the Dempster Highway didn't go where it should. Some drivers reported that the road looped back to the station no matter which direction they went. Others said the road simply ended after a few miles, disappearing into wilderness that shouldn't have been there. A few drivers claimed they'd successfully left, but their trucks were found days later, abandoned along the highway with no sign of the drivers. The reports were signed by Hetty Gallows, who appeared to have been the station manager. Her entries became increasingly desperate as the incidents accumulated. She wrote about contacting authorities, about trying to close the station, about attempting to leave herself only to find that she couldn't. The final report, dated the same day as the last logbook entry, simply said, "I understand now. This place exists outside normal geography. It's a pocket, a trap, a place where the isolation and darkness of polar night have created something that shouldn't exist. The station itself is a paradox, powered by the trucks it captures, feeding on the fuel and the drivers who stop here. I am the last person here, and I will not let it take me. But I cannot leave to warn others. All I can do is write these words and hope someone finds them before it's too late. If you're reading this, get out. Don't wait for the storm to pass. Don't look for your truck. Just walk. Pick a direction and walk until you find the real highway. It's your only chance." Amos's hands were shaking as he set down the report. He looked around the building, seeing it with new understanding. The flickering lights, the preserved food, the interrupted activities, all of it suggested a place that existed outside of normal time, sustained by some kind of energy it drew from the vehicles and people that stopped here. He had to get out. Hetty Gallows had been right. Waiting for the storm to pass, looking for his truck, trying to figure out the logistics of survival, all of that was a trap. The only way to escape was to leave now, to walk out into the polar night and the blizzard and trust that somewhere out there, the real world still existed. But looking out the window at the storm raging in the darkness, at the temperature that could kill him in minutes if he wasn't moving, at the absolute blackness beyond the station's lights, Amos felt his resolve waver. Walking out into that was almost certainly death. But staying here in this place that held on to people and fed on them somehow, that might be a fate worse than freezing. He needed more information. Needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before he made a decision that could kill him. He continued searching the building, looking for anything that might tell him more about the northern stop station and how it had come to exist as this impossible pocket outside of reality. In one of the sleeping quarters, he found a journal tucked under a mattress. The handwriting matched the reports and logbook entries. Hetty Gallows' personal account of what had happened here. Amos sat on the bed and began to read, and with each page, his understanding of his situation became more dire. Hetty had been the station manager since 1985, running what had initially been a legitimate truck stop serving the Dempster Highway. But in the winter of 1986, during an extended period of polar night, things had started to go wrong. Drivers who stopped at the station began reporting strange experiences. Time seemed to move differently inside the building. What felt like a few hours would turn out to be days when they checked their watches. The road outside would shift and change, leading different places depending on when you left. At first, Hetty had thought the drivers were suffering from isolation and darkness, that their perceptions were affected by the extreme conditions. But then she started experiencing it herself. Days would pass with no new arrivals, but the fuel in the tanks would decrease as if phantom trucks were filling up. She would hear engines idling outside at night, but when she looked, there would be no vehicles there. The supplies in the store would restock themselves, appearing fresh and new despite no deliveries coming through. She'd tried to leave in November of 1986, had packed her belongings and driven her own truck out onto the access road. But after 30 minutes of driving, she'd found herself back at the station, approaching from the same direction she'd left. She tried again and again, with the same result. The station wouldn't let her go. Other people had been there with her at various times. 2 other employees and several drivers who'd gotten trapped the same way Amos was trapped now. Some of them had tried to walk out through the storm. None of them had come back. Hetty's final entry, written on the day she'd made the last logbook notation, described her own plan to leave. "I'm going to walk south. I won't follow the road. I'll head directly across country, away from the station and away from anything it might control. Either I'll reach the real highway or I'll freeze to death in the wilderness. Both options are better than staying here and slowly becoming part of whatever this place is. To whoever finds this journal, the station feeds on isolation and darkness. It exists in the gaps between places, in the lonely stretches where normal reality gets thin. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to wait it out. Just leave, and don't look back." Amos closed the journal and sat in silence, listening to the wind howl outside and the lights flicker overhead. He thought about Hetty Gallows walking out into the polar night, choosing almost certain death over imprisonment in this impossible place. He thought about all the other drivers who'd made the same choice, and about Bram Corwin, whose truck was apparently still running somewhere without him in it. And he thought about his own options, which seemed to narrow down to 2. Stay here in relative comfort and warmth, but trapped forever in a place outside of time, or walk out into a blizzard in 50 below temperatures with only a vague hope of finding the real highway before he froze to death. Neither option was good, but Amos had been a truck driver long enough to know that sometimes there were no good options. Sometimes you just had to choose the option that gave you any chance at all, no matter how slim. He stood up from the bed and began gathering supplies. He put on every layer of clothing he could find in the sleeping quarters, packing insulation around his body until he could barely move. He filled his pockets with energy bars from the convenience store, took a flashlight from a drawer, and found a compass in the office that he hoped would still work in this strange pocket of reality. Then he went back to the main room and looked out the window one last time at his truck that was no longer there, at the storm that raged in the darkness, at the lights of the northern stop station that flickered and beckoned him to stay in their warm, false security. "Sorry, Hetty," he said quietly. "I hope you made it out, and I hope I do too." He pulled his hood tight, wrapped his scarf around his face until only his eyes were exposed, and opened the door. The Arctic wind slammed into him with brutal force, but Amos pushed forward into the storm, away from the lights, away from the impossible building, and out into the polar night where death waited, but at least offered the chance of freedom. Behind him, the northern stop station's lights flickered once more, then brightened, as if the building itself was trying to call him back. But Amos didn't look behind him. He kept walking, following the compass needle south, trusting that somewhere ahead in the darkness and cold and storm, the real world was waiting to be found. The cold hit Amos like a living thing the moment he stepped beyond the faint glow of the station's lights. It wasn't just cold, it was a presence, a force that immediately began working to shut down his body's defenses. His lungs burned with each breath, the air so frigid it felt like inhaling broken glass. Ice formed instantly on his eyelashes and the exposed skin around his eyes. The wind drove snow into every gap in his clothing, finding vulnerabilities he didn't know existed. He kept the compass in his gloved hand, checking it every few steps to make sure he was still heading south. The needle wavered and spun erratically as if confused by the magnetic fields in this place, but it generally pointed in one direction that he chose to trust. Behind him, the lights of the northern stop station grew dimmer with each step, and part of him screamed to turn back, to return to the warmth and shelter even if it meant being trapped forever. But Amos had made his choice. He kept walking, counting his steps to give himself something to focus on besides the cold and the fear. 100 steps, 200, 500. The station's lights had disappeared completely now, swallowed by the storm and darkness. He was alone in the polar night with nothing but the compass and the faint beam of his flashlight cutting through the blowing snow. The terrain was rougher than he'd expected. What should have been relatively flat tundra was instead a series of rises and depressions, as if the land itself was confused about its own geography. He stumbled through snowdrifts that came up to his waist, climbed over ridges of ice that shouldn't have been there, and pushed through stands of stunted trees that appeared and disappeared in the flashlight beam like ghosts. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, his legs were burning with exhaustion, and his core temperature was starting to drop despite all his layers. He needed to keep moving, needed to generate heat through activity, but the effort of pushing through the deep snow was draining his energy faster than he could sustain. He pulled out one of the energy bars he'd taken from the station and tried to eat it, but the bar had frozen solid, and he nearly broke a tooth trying to bite through it. The compass was acting stranger now. The needle spun wildly, pointing in random directions, as if there were multiple magnetic norths all pulling at it simultaneously. Amos realized with growing dread that he might be walking in circles, might have been walking in circles for the past half hour, with no way to know if he was getting farther from the station or somehow circling back toward it. He stopped to rest against a snow-covered boulder, trying to catch his breath and think. His body was telling him that he couldn't sustain this much longer. The cold was winning, creeping through his layers and settling into his core. His fingers and toes had gone numb, and he knew from experience that once the numbness reached his extremities, frostbite wouldn't be far behind. As he stood there in the darkness, trying to decide whether to continue or try to find shelter, he saw something that made his heart stop. Lights ahead in the storm. Not the bright lights of the station, but softer, moving lights. Headlights. Amos's first instinct was relief. Another truck, another driver, someone who could help him, or at least confirm that he'd found the real highway. He stumbled toward the lights, waving his flashlight and shouting though the wind stole his voice before it could carry more than a few feet. As he got closer, the shape of a truck emerged from the blowing snow. It was a big rig, engine running, headlights cutting through the storm. The truck was just sitting there, idling, as if the driver had stopped to wait out the weather. Amos approached the driver's side and looked up at the cab. The cab was empty. Not just empty of a driver, but empty of everything. No personal items, no coffee cups, no paperwork. The interior lights were on, the engine was running smoothly, and he could see that the fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, but there was no one inside, and when Amos tried the door, he found it unlocked. He climbed up into the cab, desperate for the warmth and shelter it offered. The heater was blasting, and the temperature inside must have been close to 70 degrees. For a few moments, Amos just sat there in the driver's seat, letting the heat thaw his frozen face and hands, trying to understand what he'd found. This had to be Bram Corwin's truck, the one mentioned in the message on the bathroom mirror. The driver who'd tried to leave the station and disappeared, leaving his truck running. But that had been in 1987, 36 years ago. No truck could idle for 36 years, even with a full tank. The engine should have seized up, the fuel should have run out, the battery should have died. Unless time worked differently here. Unless this truck, like the station itself, existed in some kind of bubble outside of normal causality. Amos searched the cab for any clue about what had happened to Bram Corwin. In the glove compartment, he found paperwork dated November 1987. The driver's log showed that Corwin had stopped at the Northern Stop Station on November 14th to wait out a storm. The same pattern Amos had followed. The last entry in the log, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, said, "Day 3 at the station. Something is wrong with this place. Other drivers have tried to leave but come back. The manager, Hetty, says she's been here for months, even though it feels like only days. I'm going to take my truck and drive until I find the real highway. If anyone finds this, tell my family I tried to get home." But Bram Corwin hadn't made it. His truck had gotten this far, maybe a mile or two from the station, and then something had happened. The driver had vanished, leaving the truck running, leaving everything behind except himself. Amos turned off the engine, knowing that if he left it running, he might end up like Corwin, disappearing and leaving behind another ghost truck idling in the polar night. He gathered what supplies he could find in the cab: a thermal blanket, a working flashlight with fresh batteries, and a flare gun with 3 flares. Then he climbed back down into the storm and continued south. But leaving the truck felt wrong somehow, as if he was abandoning a sanctuary. The wind seemed to intensify the moment his feet hit the ground, and the cold attacked with renewed vigor. He forced himself to keep walking, to not look back at the warm cab and its promise of temporary shelter. The landscape continued to shift around him in impossible ways. He crossed what should have been the same ridge 3 times, approached the same cluster of stunted trees from different angles, and found his own footprints in the snow ahead of him as if he'd been walking in circles. The station was pulling at him, trying to draw him back, using the geography itself as a trap. Amos remembered something Hetty Gallows had written in her journal. "Don't follow the road. Don't try to understand it. Just walk in one direction and keep walking." He'd been trying to use the compass, trying to navigate rationally through what was fundamentally an irrational situation. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe the only way to escape was to stop trying to make sense of it and just commit to a direction regardless of what his senses told him. He picked a star, one of the few visible through breaks in the storm clouds, and decided to walk toward it. Not south according to the compass, not following any terrain features, just straight toward that distant point of light. When the star disappeared behind clouds, he picked another one. When there were no stars visible at all, he just kept walking in what felt like a straight line, counting his steps and refusing to deviate no matter what he saw or heard. The hallucinations started around step 3000. At first, they were subtle. Sounds that could have been wind but sounded like voices, shapes in the storm that could have been snow devils but looked like people standing and watching. Amos ignored them, kept counting, kept walking. But they grew more insistent. He heard his name being called in voices he recognized, other truckers he'd worked with over the years. He saw buildings in the distance that would turn out to be ice formations when he got closer. Once, he could have sworn he saw his own truck, the one that had disappeared from the station's parking lot, sitting just ahead of him with its running lights on. But when he blinked, it was gone. the worst hallucination came around step 5000. He saw the northern stop station itself, directly ahead of him, its lights warm and welcoming. He'd walked in a complete circle, had failed to escape, was right back where he'd started. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. But then he noticed something wrong with the image. The station was mirror reversed, its layout backwards from what it should be. It wasn't real. It was the pocket reality trying one last time to convince him to give up and return. Amos closed his eyes and kept walking, refusing to look at the phantom station, refusing to acknowledge its existence. He counted his steps and thought about the real world, about real highways and real truck stops with working phones and helpful people. He thought about calling his dispatcher from a normal facility and explaining why his load was going to be late. He thought about hot coffee and warm beds and sunrise, even though sunrise was weeks away this far north. When he opened his eyes again, the phantom station was gone. And ahead of him, barely visible through the storm, was something new. A reflective marker, the kind used to mark the edges of highways in remote areas. And beyond it, another one. And beyond that, the faint impression of a road cut through the snow. Amos stumbled toward the markers, hardly daring to believe they were real. But they were solid under his gloved hands, real metal and reflective tape, not phantoms or hallucinations. He'd found the Dempster Highway, or at least something connected to the real world. He collapsed onto the snow-covered road, exhaustion finally overwhelming him. He'd been walking for hours in impossible conditions, burning energy faster than his body could produce it. His core temperature was dangerously low, his extremities were probably already suffering from frostbite, and he was on the edge of hypothermia. But he'd made it out. He'd escaped the pocket reality that had trapped Hetty Gallows and Bram Corwin, and who knew how many others. The sound of an engine brought him back to full consciousness. Headlights were approaching from the south. Real headlights attached to a real truck driven by a real person. Amos pulled out the flare gun with trembling hands and fired a flare into the sky. The bright red star arced upward and hung in the darkness, impossible to miss. The truck slowed and stopped beside him. A door opened and someone climbed down, a figure in heavy winter gear that bent over him with concern visible even through the thick face covering. "Jesus, you're half frozen," a woman's voice said. "What the hell are you doing out here on foot?" "Truck stop," Amos managed to say through lips that felt like frozen wood. "Northern stop station. Got trapped." The woman helped him to his feet and half carried him to her truck. The cab was blessedly warm, and as feelings started to return to his extremities, the pain began. Amos gritted his teeth against it, knowing that pain meant his tissue was still alive, still salvageable. "There's no truck stop around here," the woman said as she got back in the driver's seat and turned up the heat. "Not for another 150 miles. You must be confused from the cold." "It was there," Amos insisted. "Off the main highway, down a side road. Old place, from the 80s. It pulled me in and my truck disappeared." The woman gave him a concerned look. "You're not making sense. The cold can do that, mess with your head. Let's just get you to Inuvik and get you checked out by a doctor." Amos wanted to argue, wanted to convince her that what he'd experienced was real, but the warmth of the cab and the exhaustion of his ordeal were catching up with him. His eyes were closing despite his best efforts to keep them open. As consciousness faded, he heard the woman talking on her radio, reporting a stranded driver she'd found on the highway, possible hypothermia and exposure. And underneath her voice, just barely audible, he heard something else. Static on the CB radio, and within that static, voices. "Day 4 at the station. Can't find the highway. The manager says there's no way out. My truck is running, but I can't find it." Amos tried to tell the woman to change the channel, to stop listening to those voices, but sleep pulled him under before he could form the words. He woke up in a hospital in Inuvik 12 hours later. The doctor told him he'd been lucky. Moderate frostbite on his fingers and toes, but nothing that required amputation. Mild hypothermia that had responded well to warming protocols. He'd survive without permanent damage, though he'd need to stay off the road for a few weeks while his body recovered. The RCMP came to interview him while he was still in the hospital. They wanted to know about his truck, about why he'd been walking in a blizzard in the middle of nowhere, about the truck stop he claimed to have found. Amos told them everything, knowing they wouldn't believe him but feeling obligated to report what had happened. They listened politely and took notes. Then they told him that search teams had gone to the area where he'd been found, had followed the road marks looking for the side route to the northern stop station, and had found nothing. No road, no buildings, no signs of any structure having ever existed in that location. They'd used helicopters and satellite imagery and ground teams, and there was simply nothing there except empty wilderness. His truck was still missing. It hadn't been recovered, hadn't been found abandoned anywhere along the highway. As far as official records were concerned, Amos Reddick had left Dawson City with a full load of mining equipment, had gotten caught in a storm somewhere on the Dempster Highway, and had abandoned his vehicle for reasons unknown. The load was a total loss, the truck was missing, and Amos was responsible for both. But one person believed him. The woman who'd picked him up on the highway came to visit him in the hospital on his third day there. Her name was Sarah Mackenzie, and she'd been driving the Dempster Highway for 15 years. She sat beside his bed and listened as he told her the complete story, not leaving out any details no matter how impossible they sounded. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I've heard stories about a place like that. Old-timers used to talk about it back when I first started driving this route. They called it the Nowhere Station, and they said it appeared during the worst storms, during the darkest part of polar night, when reality got thin from the isolation and cold. Most people thought it was just a legend, a story truckers told to spook each other, but a few drivers claimed they'd seen it, or knew someone who'd gone missing near where it was supposed to be." "Did anyone ever escape from it before?" Amos asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not that I ever heard. The stories always ended the same way. The driver would disappear, or their truck would be found abandoned, or they'd just never be heard from again. You're the first person I've met who claims to have gotten out." "Hetty Gallows," Amos said, "the station manager. She wrote in her journal that she was going to walk away from it. Maybe she made it out too." "Maybe," Sarah said doubtfully. "Or maybe you're just the first one strong enough or lucky enough or stubborn enough to break free." After Sarah left, Amos lay in his hospital bed and thought about everything that had happened. About the station existing outside of time and space. About Bram Corwin's truck still running somewhere in the darkness. About Hetty Gallows walking into the storm and possibly finding freedom, or possibly just freezing to death. He thought about his own truck, which was still missing and would probably never be recovered. It was sitting in that parking lot at the northern stop station. He was certain of it, waiting for him to come back. Or maybe it had become part of the station's collection, another piece of the pocket reality. Fuel for whatever impossible mechanism kept that place existing. The insurance company denied his claim, ruling that he'd abandoned his vehicle without sufficient cause. His employer fired him for failure to deliver the load and for losing an expensive truck. His reputation in the trucking community took a hit, with rumors spreading that he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown in the polar darkness and made up an elaborate story to cover his own mistakes. But Amos knew the truth. The northern stop station was real. It existed somewhere in the gaps between normal geography, appearing during extreme conditions to trap unwary drivers. And it was still there, still waiting, still adding to its collection of abandoned trucks and missing people. Before he left Inuvik to fly back south, Amos went to the RCMP detachment one more time. He asked if they had any records of missing truckers on the Dempster Highway, particularly from the 1980s. The officer he spoke with was reluctant at first, but something about Amos's intensity made him check. There had been 17 truckers who'd disappeared on the Dempster Highway between 1985 and 90. 17 drivers who'd simply vanished, leaving no trace, their trucks either never found or discovered abandoned with no sign of the drivers. After 90, the disappearances had stopped, or at least they'd stopped being officially recorded. One of the missing drivers was named Bram Corwin, disappeared November 16, 1987. Another was Hetty Gallows, last seen November 17, 1987, when she told her relief manager she was going for a walk to check the access road conditions. She'd never come back. Amos had the officer print out the list of names and took it with him when he left. 17 people, all of them trapped in that impossible place, or dead in the wilderness trying to escape it. And those were just the ones from a 5-year period. How many others had the station claimed over the decades? How many trucks were parked in that frozen parking lot, their engines idling eternally, their drivers vanished into the polar night? He thought about trying to organize a rescue mission, about convincing someone with resources and authority that the Northern Stop Station was real and needed to be investigated. But he knew no one would believe him. He had no proof, no evidence, just his word, and a list of cold cases that could be explained by any number of more rational causes. So Amos did the only thing he could do. He wrote down everything that had happened, every detail he could remember about the station and its history, and the warnings Hetty Gallows had left behind. He posted his account on trucking forums and social media groups, knowing that most people would dismiss it as fiction or the ramblings of someone who'd been affected by the polar darkness. But maybe, just maybe, his warning would reach someone who needed it. Another driver approaching the Dempster Highway during a storm, seeing a sign for a truck stop that shouldn't exist, thinking about pulling in for shelter. If his story could save even one person from the fate of those 17 missing drivers, then losing his truck and his job and his reputation would be worth it. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Amos would think about that place still existing somewhere in the darkness. He'd think about all those trucks sitting in that parking lot, engines running, headlights on, waiting for drivers who would never return. He'd think about Bram Corwin's truck that he'd found, idling in the storm, its cab empty and warm and inviting. And he'd think about his own Peterbilt, still parked at the Northern Stop Station, adding its fuel to whatever sustained that pocket of impossible reality. Maybe someday, another driver would find their way there during a storm. They'd see his truck sitting in the lot, would climb inside seeking shelter, and would find his logbook with the final entry he'd made before deciding to walk into the polar night. If you're reading this, you've made the same mistake I did. This place is a trap. Don't wait for conditions to improve. Don't look for logic or explanations. Just leave. Walk away and don't look back. Your truck is already lost. Don't let yourself be lost, too. That was the warning Amos wished he'd found when he first entered the Northern Stop Station. And it was the warning he'd left for whoever came after him, knowing that despite all precautions, and all stories and all common sense, eventually another driver would find that sign in the storm and make the same choice he'd made. Because that's what truckers did. They took shelter when storms hit. They helped each other in remote places. They trusted that a truck stop with lights on would offer safety and warmth. And sometimes, in the darkest, most isolated places on Earth, that trust led them into traps they couldn't escape. The Northern Stop Station was still out there, still waiting, still adding to its collection. And Amos could do nothing about it except tell his story and hope someone would listen before it was too late. 6 months after his escape from the Northern Stop Station, Amos Reddick found himself driving again, though not the long-haul routes he'd spent years perfecting. Without the proper insurance, and with his record marked by the abandoned vehicle incident, no major trucking company would hire him. Instead, he'd taken a job driving local deliveries around Whitehorse, short runs that kept him within a few hours of civilization and far away from the Dempster Highway. But he couldn't stop thinking about the station and the drivers who hadn't escaped. The list of 17 names haunted him, especially now that he'd started researching each one. Every missing driver had a story, a family, a life that had been cut short by that impossible place. And the more he dug into the disappearances, the more patterns he found that suggested the Northern Stop Station had been claiming victims for much longer than just those 5 years in the 80s. He'd tried to move on, tried to accept that some mysteries couldn't be solved and some wrongs couldn't be righted. But then he'd received a message through one of the trucking forums where he'd posted his account. Someone claiming to have information about the station. Someone who wanted to meet in person to discuss what they knew. The message was from a woman named Dorothy Gallows, and she'd signed it with a single line that made Amos's blood run cold. Hetty was my sister. I need to know what happened to her. They'd agreed to meet at a diner in Whitehorse on a Tuesday afternoon when Amos wasn't working. He arrived early and sat in a booth by the window, watching the parking lot and trying to figure out what he was going to say to the sister of a woman who'd been missing for 36 years. Dorothy Gallows arrived precisely on time. She was in her 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd lived a hard northern life. She spotted Amos immediately, as if she'd been studying his photo and slid into the booth across from him without preamble. "You're the trucker who escaped from my sister's station," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Amos replied. "I found her journal there. Her warnings probably saved my life." Dorothy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Pain, or maybe hope. "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out, no matter how strange it sounds. I've spent 36 years trying to understand what happened to Hetty, and I think you're the first person who might actually have answers." So Amos told her everything, starting from the moment he'd seen the sign for the Northern Stop Station and ending with his escape onto the real highway. He described the building in detail, the frozen food and abandoned belongings, the logbooks and incident reports. He quoted passages from Hetty's journal, the parts he could remember clearly, and described her final decision to walk away from the station into the polar night. When he finished, Dorothy sat in silence for a long moment, staring at her untouched coffee. Finally, she spoke. "Hetty bought that station in 1985. She'd been working truck stops across the north for years, saving money. And when the Northern Stop came up for sale, she jumped at it. Remote location, but good business potential serving the Dempster Highway traffic. She called me after her first winter there. Said strange things were happening, but she couldn't quite explain what. Drivers reporting lost time, supplies disappearing and reappearing, the geography around the station not making sense." "Did she ever tell you she was trapped there?" Amos asked. "Not in those words. But her letters got stranger as time went on. She'd write about things that had happened months ago as if they'd just occurred. She'd mentioned seeing drivers who I knew had gone missing weeks earlier. And then in November of 1987, the letters stopped completely. I reported her missing, but the RCMP said they'd investigated and found the station abandoned. No sign of foul play. They assumed she'd walked away from the business and started a new life somewhere else. But she didn't," Amos said. "No, Hetty wouldn't have done that. She wasn't a quitter, and she wouldn't have left without telling me." Dorothy pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "I've been collecting information about that station for 36 years. Every missing driver report, every strange story, every rumor and legend. I need you to look at this and tell me if any of it matches what you experienced." Amos opened the folder and began reading. The documents inside painted a disturbing picture. The Northern Stop Station had been built in 1947, one of several facilities constructed to support the newly opened Dempster Highway route. But almost from the beginning there had been problems. The first manager had disappeared after only 6 months. The second manager had quit after reporting temporal anomalies that his supervisors dismissed as isolation-induced paranoia. By the 1950s, the station had gained a reputation among local truckers as an unlucky place. Drivers who stopped there reported feeling disoriented, losing track of time, seeing things that couldn't be explained. Several disappearances were loosely connected to the station, but nothing was ever proven. The facility changed hands multiple times, closing and reopening under different names and management. But the same pattern of strange incidents continued. What made Amos's skin crawl was a report from 1983, 2 years before Hetty had bought the place. A geological survey team had been studying the area around the station and had reported unusual magnetic readings and gravitational anomalies. They'd recommended further investigation, but their funding had been cut and the study was never completed. Their preliminary conclusion, buried in technical language, suggested that the area existed in some kind of dimensional pocket where normal physical laws didn't consistently apply. "They knew," Amos said, looking up at Dorothy. "Someone knew that place was wrong, and they let your sister buy it anyway. The previous owner probably didn't disclose the problems, and Hetty was stubborn. Even if someone had warned her, she might have dismissed it as superstition." Dorothy leaned forward. "But here's what I need to know. In her journal, did Hetty say anything about how to destroy the station, how to close it permanently?" Amos thought back to the journal entries he'd read. She talked about it being sustained by the vehicles it trapped, feeding on their fuel somehow. She thought that if no one stopped there, if it couldn't capture any more trucks, it might eventually collapse on its own. "But drivers keep stopping there," Dorothy said. "Every few years, someone disappears on that stretch of the Dempster. The official reports say they got lost in storms or drove off the road. But I think they found the station. I think it's still operating, still trapping people." Amos knew she was right. The CB voices he'd heard as he was losing consciousness in Sarah Mackenzie's truck. The recent sounding transmissions from drivers who should have been missing for decades all pointed to the station still existing and still claiming victims. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Dorothy's expression hardened with determination. "I want to go there. I want to find the station and figure out how to shut it down permanently. And I need someone who's been there, someone who escaped, to guide me." "That's insane," Amos said flatly. "I barely made it out alive, and I was young and strong and lucky. You want to deliberately go to a place that traps people and try to destroy it somehow? We wouldn't last an hour." "Then we prepare," Dorothy replied. "We study everything we can about the station. We figure out its patterns, when and where it appears, what conditions make it manifest. We go in with a plan and with the knowledge to execute it. And we document everything so that if we don't make it out, at least others will know the truth." Amos wanted to say no. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was suicide, that Dorothy was letting her grief and determination drive her toward a foolish death. But he looked at the folder in front of him, at the names of 17 missing drivers from just a 5-year period, and he thought about how many more names there might be if he went back further, or looked ahead to future disappearances. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "Give me a week to consider whether this is even possible." Dorothy nodded and stood to leave. "I've waited 36 years. I can wait 1 more week. But Amos, understand this. I'm going with or without you. I'm not getting any younger. and I need to know what happened to my sister before I die. Your help would make success more likely, but it won't change my decision." She left him sitting in the diner with the folder of documents, and Amos spent the next 3 hours reading through every page, absorbing every detail about the Northern Stop Station and its history of claiming victims. Over the following week, Amos found himself unable to think about anything else. He researched dimensional pockets and temporal anomalies, diving into physics papers he barely understood. He studied Arctic survival techniques and extreme cold weather gear. He mapped out the Dempster Highway and tried to identify the exact location where he'd found the station, though he knew from experience that its position might not be fixed. But most importantly, he wrestled with the question of whether he had an obligation to help. He'd escaped when 17 others hadn't. He'd been given a second chance that Hetty Gallows and Bram Corwin and all the others never got. Did that create a responsibility to try to help them, or at least to prevent future victims? On the 7th day, he called Dorothy and told her he'd do it. They spent the next 3 months planning. Dorothy had resources, money saved over decades of working in Yukon's mining industry, and she used it to acquire the best cold weather gear available, satellite communication equipment, and emergency supplies. Amos contributed his knowledge of the station's layout and his experience navigating the pocket reality it created. Their plan was simple in concept but difficult in execution. They would drive to the approximate area where Amos had encountered the station, wait for conditions that matched his experience, a major storm during the deepest part of polar night, and actively search for the access road that led to the facility. Once there, they would document everything they could, try to understand the mechanism that sustained the pocket reality, and if possible, find a way to disrupt it. They both knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that doing nothing meant condemning future drivers to the same fate as those who'd already disappeared. They left Whitehorse in late December, driving north in Amos's new truck, a modest delivery vehicle he'd purchased with his savings. Dorothy rode in the passenger seat, reviewing their supplies and equipment, while Amos navigated the increasingly remote highway. They reached the Dempster Highway junction and turned north, entering the vast emptiness of the Arctic winter. The weather forecast showed a major storm system moving in, the kind of conditions that had been present during Amos's first encounter with the station. They drove through the polar darkness, watching for the sign that marked the access road, but found nothing. Mile after mile of empty highway passed beneath their wheels, and Amos began to worry that the station only appeared to certain people, or under specific circumstances they hadn't yet identified. "Tell me about when you saw the sign," Dorothy said as they approached the area where Amos estimated the encounter had occurred. "What exactly were you thinking? What was your state of mind?" Amos thought back. "I was worried about fuel, worried about the storm, looking for any option that would give me shelter and safety. I was desperate, I guess. Desperate enough to take a chance on an unknown facility." "Desperation," Dorothy repeated. "Maybe that's the key. Maybe the station only reveals itself to people who are vulnerable, who need it badly enough to overlook the warning signs." They drove another 50 miles north, then turned around and came back south, searching both directions. The storm was intensifying now, snow beginning to fall and wind picking up. Amos was starting to run low on fuel, though he'd planned for that, carrying extra diesel in jerry cans in the truck bed. As they passed through the same stretch for the third time, now fully engaged in the blizzard, Amos saw it. The sign, barely visible through the snow, directing them to the Northern Stop Station 2 miles ahead. "There," he said, pointing. "Did you see it?" Dorothy leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "I see a sign, but I can't read what it says. The snow's too thick." Amos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The station was showing itself to him, but Dorothy couldn't see it clearly. Maybe because he'd been there before, or maybe because he was the one driving and therefore the one the station wanted to trap. "We're going in," he said, making the turn onto the access road. "Stay alert and remember everything we discussed. We document, we investigate, and we leave before we get trapped." The access road looked exactly as it had during his first visit. Snow-covered, rough, barely maintained. The 2 miles seemed to take forever. The truck struggling through drifts and over ice, but eventually the station appeared through the storm. It looked unchanged from Amos's memory. The same weathered buildings, the same flickering lights, the same sense of wrongness that permeated the entire area. But this time there were other vehicles in the parking lot. 3 trucks, all of them running, all of them empty. "My God," Dorothy whispered. "It's real. After all these years of wondering, it's actually real." Amos parked at the edge of the lot, positioning his truck for a quick exit if needed. They'd agreed not to shut off the engine, not to make the same mistake that had cost him his previous truck. He left it idling and climbed down with Dorothy, both of them bundled against the brutal cold. The main building's door was unlocked, just as before. Inside, the scene was almost exactly as Amos remembered, with one critical difference. There were people there now. 2 men and a woman sat at the tables in the main room, drinking from steaming cups and talking quietly. They looked up as Amos and Dorothy entered, and their expressions showed surprise but not alarm. "New arrivals," one of the men said. He was middle-aged, with a beard frosted with ice. "Welcome to the northern stop. Storm's bad out there. You folks looking for a place to wait it out?" Amos felt his heart pounding. These people looked real, sounded real, but something was off about them. Their clothes were from different eras, one man wearing a jacket style from the early 2000s, the woman in something that looked 80s, the other man in gear that could have been from the 90s. "How long have you been here?" Dorothy asked, her voice steady despite the tension Amos could see in her posture. The bearded man shrugged. "Couple days, maybe? Storm's been persistent. We're waiting for it to clear before we head back out." "What year is it?" Amos asked bluntly. The 3 drivers exchanged glances, and something shifted in their expressions. Confusion, or maybe the beginning of realization. "It's 2003, the woman said slowly. "December 2003. "Why? What year do you think it is?" Amos and Dorothy looked at each other. The woman thought it was 2003. She'd been here for 20 years, thinking it had only been a couple of days. "I need to show you something," Dorothy said, pulling out her phone and approaching the table. She opened a news app showing the current date, December 19th, 2023. The 3 drivers stared at the phone screen, and Amos watched understanding dawn in their eyes. Horror, denial, disbelief, all of it playing across their faces as they realized the truth. "That's not possible," the bearded man said. "I stopped here on December 11th, 2003, 3 days ago. I'm hauling a load that's due in Inuvik on the 15th. I can't have been here for 20 years. "This place exists outside normal time," Amos explained gently. "You've been trapped here, all of you, for years or decades depending on when you arrived. The station feeds on the trucks, on the fuel, on something about the presence of vehicles and people, and it keeps you in a loop where you don't realize how much time has passed." The woman stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "My family, my kids, they must think I'm dead." "You need to leave," Dorothy said urgently. "All of you. Get in your trucks and drive away from this place. Don't follow the road. Just pick a direction and keep going until you find the real highway." "But the storm," one of the men began. "The storm is part of the trap," Amos interrupted. "It's always storming here. If you wait for conditions to improve, you'll wait forever. You have to leave now, while you still can." The three drivers looked at each other, and Amos could see them struggling with the decision. Everything they thought they knew was being turned upside down, and he was asking them to walk out into a deadly storm on faith alone. "I was here before," Amos said, "6 months ago. I escaped by walking away from the station, and I found the real highway. It's possible, but you have to do it now, before the station reasserts its hold on you." The bearded man stood. "My truck, you said our trucks are still running?" "They're in the parking lot," Dorothy confirmed. "Engines idling, just like you left them." That seemed to decide it for them. The three drivers gathered what few possessions they had and headed for the door. Amos and Dorothy watched as they found their trucks, climbed inside, and one by one drove out of the parking lot and disappeared into the storm. "Will they make it?" Dorothy asked quietly. "I don't know," Amos admitted. "But they have a chance now. More than they had sitting here thinking it was still 2003. Now came the hardest part. They needed to search the station for information about how it worked and how to shut it down. But every minute they spent here increased the risk of becoming trapped themselves. Amos kept his keys in his hand and one eye on the door, ready to run at the first sign that the station was trying to claim them. They split up to cover more ground. Dorothy searched the office and filing cabinets while Amos explored the back rooms. He found more evidence of trapped drivers, belongings from different decades scattered throughout the building. Proof that the station had been claiming victims for far longer than the documented cases suggested. In one of the sleeping quarters, he found something that made his breath catch. A driver's log with Bram Corwin's name on it, and beside it, a journal with entries that continued past November 1987. Corwin hadn't disappeared the night he'd left the station. He'd made it back, somehow, and had stayed here for at least several more weeks based on the journal dates. The entries detailed Legsman Corwin's growing understanding of the station's nature. He'd experimented with the pocket reality, testing its boundaries and trying to understand the physics that sustained it. His final entry was dated January 4th, 1988. "I've figured it out. The station exists at a convergence point where multiple timelines intersect. Every truck that stops here creates an anchor point, tethering a specific moment in time to this location. The more anchors, the stronger the pocket reality becomes. But there's a core, a central point where the convergence is strongest. It's in the basement, underneath the main building. I'm going down there to see if I can disrupt it. If this is my last entry, at least I tried." Amos showed the journal to Dorothy. "There's a basement. Corwin went down there and never came back." "Then that's where we need to go," Dorothy said firmly. They found the basement entrance behind a storage room in the back of the building. A narrow stairway descended into darkness, and even from the top of the stairs, Amos could feel something wrong about the space below. A pressure in the air, a subtle wrongness that made his instincts scream at him to stay away. But they'd come this far. They'd found trapped drivers and sent them toward potential freedom. And if there was any chance of shutting down the station permanently, of preventing future victims, it lay in that basement. Amos descended first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, with Dorothy close behind. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending far beyond the footprint of the building above. And in the center of the space, surrounded by decades of accumulated junk and abandoned equipment, was something that defied explanation. It looked like a tear in reality itself, a shimmering discontinuity in the air that hurt to look at directly. Around it were parked more trucks than should have been able to fit in the space, all of them running, all of them empty. And standing near the tier, motionless as statues, were people. Dozens of people. Drivers who'd gotten too close to the core and become part of it somehow. One of them was a woman in clothing from the 1980s. Amos recognized her from the photo Dorothy had shown him. "Hetty?" Dorothy whispered, moving toward her sister. Don't. Amos grabbed her arm. Don't get too close. Look at them. They're not moving, not breathing. They're trapped here more completely than anyone upstairs. Dorothy's face was streaked with tears. Can we free them? Amos studied the tear in reality and the people frozen around it. I don't think so. I think they're part of the structure now, part of what keeps this place existing. If we disrupt it, we might destroy them too. Then we destroy it, Dorothy said, her voice hard. We shut this place down, even if it means Hetty doesn't come back. She wouldn't want this to continue. She wouldn't want more people to suffer what she suffered. They'd brought thermite charges, industrial-grade equipment that Dorothy had acquired through her mining contacts. The plan had been to damage the building's core structure if they couldn't find another way to shut down the station. But now, looking at the tear in reality and understanding that it was the core that sustained everything, Amos had a different idea. We need to close the tear, he said. Break the convergence point. But I don't know if thermite will affect something that exists outside normal physics. There's only one way to find out, Dorothy said, pulling out the charges. They worked quickly, placing the thermite around the tear while carefully avoiding the frozen drivers. The charges would burn at over 4,000 degrees, hot enough to melt through steel, and Amos hoped that extreme heat applied directly to the discontinuity would disrupt whatever mechanism kept it stable. They set the timers for 5 minutes and ran back up the stairs, through the building, and out to their truck. Amos had the engine in gear and was moving before Dorothy had fully closed her door, racing away from the station as fast as the snow and ice would allow. Behind them, light flared through the basement windows of the northern stop station. Not the orange glow of normal fire, but something else, something that shifted through colors that shouldn't exist. The building shuddered, and through his mirrors Amos saw it begin to fold in on itself, collapsing not down but inward, as if being pulled into a point that existed in more dimensions than the normal 3. Then it was gone. The northern stop station, the pocket reality, the trap that had claimed so many lives over so many decades, simply ceased to exist. Where the buildings had stood was now just empty tundra, snow-covered and dark, no sign that anything had ever been there. Amos drove for another hour before he felt safe enough to stop. They sat in the idling truck, both of them shaking from adrenaline and cold, and the enormity of what they'd just done. Did we kill them? Dorothy asked quietly. All those frozen drivers in the basement? I don't know, Amos said honestly. But if they were still alive in any meaningful sense, being trapped forever like that wasn't living. Maybe we freed them. Or maybe we just ended their suffering. Either way, it was better than leaving them there. Dorothy nodded slowly, tears running down her face. Thank you for helping me. For giving me closure. Even if it wasn't the closure I wanted. They drove back to Whitehorse in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The RCMP would never believe what they'd done, and they agreed not to report it. The northern stop station had officially never existed anyway, so its destruction couldn't be documented. But in the weeks that followed, Amos noticed something. Reports of missing truckers on the Dempster Highway dropped to 0. The steady trickle of disappearances that had continued for decades, dismissed as accidents or drivers fleeing their lives, suddenly stopped. The road was no safer than before, the polar night no less dark, but the trap that had claimed so many victims was finally gone. Sometimes, Amos wondered about the 3 drivers they'd sent out into the storm, whether they'd found the real highway or frozen in the wilderness. He'd tried to search for missing person reports being resolved, for drivers from 2003 and earlier suddenly reappearing, but found nothing. Maybe they'd made it and were quietly rebuilding their lives. Or maybe the pocket reality had claimed them one last time before it collapsed. He'd never know for certain. But late at night, when he drove dark roads under Arctic skies, Amos liked to think that somewhere out there, those drivers had found their way home. That Hetty Gallows and Bram Corwin and all the others trapped in that basement had finally found peace. And that no driver would ever again see a sign for the northern stop station promising shelter from a storm and ending up trapped in a place outside of time. 3 years after the destruction of the northern stop station, Amos Reddick was driving the Dempster Highway again. He'd worked his way back up through the industry, rebuilding his reputation one careful delivery at a time, until a company finally gave him another chance at long-haul work. The pay was good, the routes were familiar, and Amos told himself he'd put the experience with the station behind him. But the Dempster Highway in polar night was different now. Not safer exactly, but cleaner somehow. As if the removal of that pocket reality had changed something fundamental about the road's character. Other drivers noticed it too, though they couldn't articulate what had shifted. The disappearances had stopped, and the highway felt less hungry, less willing to swallow people who made mistakes. Amos was hauling mining equipment north to Inuvik, a routine run he'd made dozens of times before the incident with the station. It was mid-January, the darkest part of winter, and the temperature had dropped to minus 48 degrees. The aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green and purple, and the road ahead disappeared into blackness, broken only by his headlights. Around midnight, as he was passing through the area where the northern stop station had once existed, his CB radio crackled to life. Amos Reddick. The voice was female, distorted by static but clear enough to understand. "Can you hear me?" Amos felt ice water flood his veins. He grabbed the microphone with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "This is Amos. Who's calling?" "You know who this is," the voice said. "You found my journal. You read my warnings. You escaped when I couldn't." "Hetty Gallows," Amos whispered. "What's left of her," the voice confirmed. Or maybe just an echo, a recording trapped in the electromagnetic field where the station used to be. "I don't know what I am anymore, but I wanted to thank you for freeing us, for destroying that place before it could claim more victims." "Are you at peace?" Amos asked, not sure if the question even made sense. The static on the CB intensified, and for a moment Amos thought he'd lost the connection. Then Hetty's voice came back, fainter now. "I don't know what peace means when you've been trapped outside of time for 36 years. But I'm not in the basement anymore. None of us are. That's something." "The 3 drivers we sent out into the storm," Amos said. "Did they make it?" "2 of them did. They found the highway, drove south, and returned to lives that had moved on without them. The 3rd one froze about a mile from the station. He's buried up here now, finally at rest. Better than being trapped forever. And Dorothy, Hetty, your sister helped destroy the station. She spent 36 years looking for you." "I know." The static made it hard to tell, but Amos thought he heard emotion in the voice. "Tell her I'm grateful. Tell her I'm sorry she had to live with not knowing for so long. Tell her the younger sister she remembers is gone, but what's left of me appreciates what she did." The transmission was breaking up now, the voice fading in and out. "Amos, one more thing. The station is gone, but the convergence point isn't completely closed. There are still thin places on this highway, especially during polar night. Be careful. Don't stop in areas that feel wrong. Don't trust lights that appear where they shouldn't be. The Dempster is safer now, but it's not safe." "I understand," Amos said. "Thank you for the warning. Thank you for listening to my warnings back then. You're stronger than most, Amos Reddick. Stay that way." The CB fell silent, returning to the normal hiss and crackle of empty channels. Amos drove on through the darkness, processing what he'd just heard. He destroyed the station 3 years ago, but somehow, Hetty Gallows or something that had been Hetty was still able to reach across the distance and make contact. Maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe destroying the station hadn't killed the trapped drivers so much as freed them into a different kind of existence. An existence that allowed them to communicate, to warn others, to serve as guardians of the highway that had claimed them. The miles rolled by beneath his wheels, and Amos found himself thinking about all the drivers who'd been trapped in that basement, frozen in time around the convergence point. Hetty, Bram Corwin, and dozens of others whose names he'd never learned. What had happened to them when the thermite charges disrupted the tear in reality? Had they simply ceased to exist? Or had they been scattered across time and space, their consciousness preserved in some form that allowed them to still interact with the physical world? Around 3 in the morning, Amos stopped at a legitimate truck stop in Eagle Plains to refuel and grab coffee. The place was nearly empty, just one other truck parked in the lot. Inside, the driver was an older man Amos recognized from previous runs, a guy named Thornton who'd been driving the Dempster for 20 years. "Amos," Thornton greeted him with a nod. "Haven't seen you up here in a while. Heard you had some trouble a few years back." "You could say that," Amos replied, pouring coffee that was slightly better than motor oil, but not by much. "Lost a truck in a storm. Took me a while to get back in the game." Thornton studied him for a moment. "You're the one who went around warning people about that phantom truck stop, right? The one that supposedly trapped drivers." Amos tensed. "You heard about that?" "Hard not to. The story made the rounds through the whole community. Most people thought you'd had some kind of breakdown from the isolation. But you know what's funny? After you started telling that story, the disappearances stopped. We used to lose a driver every year or two on this highway, sometimes more. Trucks found abandoned, drivers never located, the usual mysteries. But in the past 3 years, nothing. Road's been clear." "Maybe people are just being more careful," Amos suggested. "Maybe," Thornton agreed, but his expression said he didn't believe it. "Or maybe there was something out there taking people, and somebody finally stopped it. If that somebody was you, well, a lot of us owe you a debt we can't repay." Amos didn't know what to say to that. He changed the subject, asked about road conditions ahead, and finished his coffee in uncomfortable silence. But as he was leaving, Thornton called after him. "One more thing. I've been having dreams lately, about a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing beside the highway in the dark. She doesn't say anything, just watches the trucks go by, like she's keeping guard. You ever see anything like that?" Amos felt the hair on his arms stand up. "No. But if you do see her, don't stop. Just acknowledge her and keep driving." Thornton nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. Safe travels, Amos." Back on the highway, Amos thought about Thornton's dreams. Hetty watching over the road, standing guard against whatever other dangers might lurk in the polar night. It was a strange kind of afterlife, but maybe it was the one she'd chosen. Or maybe it was the only one available to someone who'd been trapped outside of time for so long. He was approaching the area where the station had been when his headlights picked out something on the side of the road. A figure, standing motionless in the snow. Amos's first instinct was to slow down, to check if someone needed help. But then he remembered the warnings, both Hetty's and his own instincts honed by years of driving dangerous roads. As he passed the figure, his headlights illuminated it clearly for just a moment. A woman in clothing from the 1980s, her face pale and expressionless, watching the highway with eyes that reflected his lights like an animal's. She made no move to flag him down, didn't wave or call for help. She just stood there, bearing witness to the trucks that passed, a guardian or a warning or maybe both. Amos raised one hand from the steering wheel in acknowledgement as he drove past. In his mirror, he saw the figure was gone, as if she'd never been there at all. The rest of the drive to Inuvik was uneventful, and Amos made his delivery without incident. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen, about Hetty Gallows standing watch over the highway that had claimed her. He wondered if the other drivers trapped in the basement were out there too, scattered along the Dempster, serving as silent guardians against threats they couldn't prevent but could at least warn about. After unloading in Inuvik, Amos called Dorothy. She'd moved to Vancouver after their expedition, trying to put distance between herself and the memories of her sister's fate. But she'd given Amos her number and made him promise to stay in touch, to let her know if he ever encountered anything unusual on his drives through the north. "I heard her voice on the CB," Amos told Dorothy. "Hetty. She thanked us for destroying the station." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Was it really her, or just some kind of recording, an echo of who she used to be? "I don't know," Amos admitted. "Maybe there's no difference anymore. But she said to tell you she was grateful for what you did, and that she's sorry you had to wait so long for answers." He heard Dorothy's breath catch. Did she sound like herself? Like my sister? She sounded like someone who'd been through more than any person should have to endure, Amos said carefully. But there was still something human in her voice, something that cared about warning other drivers, about protecting people from the dangers she couldn't escape. "That sounds like Hetty," Dorothy said softly. She always was stubborn about helping people, even when it cost her. I guess some things don't change, even after death. They talked for another hour, and Amos told her about Thornton's dreams and the figure he'd seen beside the road. Dorothy listened without judgment, and when he finished, she shared her own experiences. "I dream about that basement sometimes," she said. "About all those frozen drivers standing around the convergence point. And in my dreams, they're not frozen anymore. They're moving, walking away from that place, scattering across the north. I used to think it was just wishful thinking, my mind trying to give me closure. But maybe it's something more. Maybe we really did free them, and they're still out there in some form." "Would that be better or worse than them just being dead?" Amos asked. "I don't know," Dorothy replied. "But at least they're not trapped anymore. At least they have some kind of existence beyond being fuel for that impossible place. That has to count for something." After hanging up with Dorothy, Amos sat in his truck and thought about the nature of the trap they'd destroyed. The northern stop station had existed in a pocket outside of normal time and space, sustained by the vehicles and people it captured. But what if destroying the convergence point hadn't actually killed the trapped drivers? What if it had just released them from their physical anchoring, allowing their consciousness to persist in a different form? It was a question he couldn't answer, and probably no one could. The physics that had allowed the station to exist were beyond normal understanding, so the aftermath of its destruction was equally inexplicable. Over the following years, Amos continued to drive the Dempster Highway, and he continued to encounter strange things in the polar night. Not the overt trap of the northern stop station, but subtler phenomena. Voices on the CB that offered warnings about road conditions ahead, always accurate, always helpful. Lights in the distance that seemed to guide trucks away from dangerous areas. Figures standing beside the road during the darkest hours, watching but never interfering. Other drivers reported similar experiences, though most dismissed them as isolation-induced hallucinations or tricks of the light. But Amos knew better. He recognized the patterns, understood what he was seeing. The drivers who'd been trapped in the station weren't gone. They'd become part of the highway itself, woven into the fabric of the place that had claimed them, serving as guardians for those who still drove through the endless winter darkness. It wasn't a perfect solution. The northern highways were still dangerous, and drivers still died in accidents or got lost in storms. But the deliberate predation had stopped. No more pocket realities feeding on vehicles and trapping people outside of time. The road was what it had always been before the station's creation. Hostile but honest, dangerous but not malicious. Amos thought about writing down the full story, documenting everything that had happened from his first encounter with the station to its destruction and the strange aftermath. But he decided against it. The story was too strange, too full of gaps and unanswerable questions. Better to let it remain what it had become. A legend among northern truckers, a warning passed from driver to driver, a reminder to be careful about where you stop during polar night. 5 years after destroying the station, Amos made his last run on the Dempster Highway. He was getting older, the hard years of Arctic driving taking their toll on his body, and he'd decided to transition to warmer routes down south. But he wanted to make one final trip through the darkness. One last journey past the place where the northern stop station had claimed so many lives. He drove north in late January, when the polar night was at its deepest. The temperature was 51 below zero, and the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that seemed almost alive. As he approached the area where the station had been, he slowed his truck and pulled over to the shoulder, sitting with his engine idling and his eyes on the empty landscape. There was nothing there now, just snow-covered tundra stretching out into the darkness. No sign that a building had ever existed in this place, but Amos could feel the history, the weight of all those trapped years pressing down on this spot. This was where Hetty Gallows had spent decades trying to warn people about the danger they were walking into, where Bram Corwin had tried and failed to escape, leaving his truck idling in the storm while he vanished into the convergence point, where dozens of other drivers had stopped seeking shelter and never left. As Amos sat there, a figure appeared in his headlights. The woman in 80s clothing, Hetty Gallows, or what remained of her, standing in the snow and watching his truck. But this time she wasn't just watching. She walked toward his cab, moving through the snow without leaving footprints, and stopped beside his driver's side window. Amos rolled down the window despite the blast of Arctic air that invaded his cab. Up close, Hetty looked more substantial than she had the other times he'd seen her. Her face had details he could make out clearly, and her eyes held intelligence and awareness. "Last trip?" she asked, her voice clear without the CB static. "Last one on this highway," Amos confirmed. "I'm getting too old for this kind of driving. Time to find easier routes." Hetty nodded. "You've been good for this road, Amos. You helped clean it up, made it safer. We appreciate that." "We?" "All of us who got trapped. We're still here, in a way, watching over the highway, helping where we can. It's not what any of us would have chosen, but it gives us purpose. That's more than we had in the basement." "Are you all right?" Amos asked, not sure if the question made sense for someone in her condition. "I mean, is this existence bearable?" Hetty considered the question. "I don't feel cold anymore. Don't feel hunger or pain. Time doesn't pass the same way it used to. I exist in moments scattered along this highway, appearing when I'm needed. It's strange, but it's not suffering, and it's better than being trapped." "Your sister asks about you sometimes," Amos said. "Dorothy, she wants to know if you're at peace." "Tell her I am," Hetty replied, "as much as anyone can be in this state. Tell her I'm proud of her for having the courage to destroy that place, and grateful that she never stopped looking for answers. And tell her that when her time comes, I'll be waiting to help her across. That's what family does." Amos nodded, not trusting his voice. "One more thing," Hetty continued. "The convergence point isn't completely closed. It's stable now, contained, but there's still a thin place here. During the worst storms, during the darkest nights, reality can still get confused. If you ever hear about drivers seeing strange things in this area, or if new disappearances start, you need to come back. You and Dorothy. You're the only ones who know how to fix it if it breaks again." I will, Amos promised. But I hope it doesn't come to that. So do I, Hetty said. She started to fade, her form becoming translucent in the headlights. Safe travels, Amos Reddick. Thank you for listening when I tried to warn you all those years ago. You saved yourself by paying attention to the warnings others had left behind. Then she was gone, and Amos was alone on the highway with just the wind and the darkness and the aurora dancing overhead. He sat there for another few minutes, saying a silent goodbye to the highway that had shaped so much of his life, and to the people who'd been claimed by it. Then he put his truck in gear and continued north, completing his final delivery to Inuvik before turning around and heading back south, away from the Dempster Highway and the ghosts that guarded it. Years later, when Amos was retired and living in southern British Columbia, he still kept track of news from the north. He monitored reports of missing truckers, paid attention to stories about strange phenomena on the Dempster Highway, and stayed in touch with Dorothy, who'd become something like family over their shared experience. The highway remained clear. No new disappearances, no reports of phantom truck stops or temporal anomalies. The northern stop station stayed buried in the past where it belonged, and the drivers it had trapped continued their vigilant watch over the road that had claimed them. Sometimes, late at night, Amos would dream about the highway. In his dreams, he was driving through the polar darkness, and all along the roadside stood figures watching over him. Hetty Gallows and Bram Corwin and all the others, serving as guardians of the Dempster, protecting living drivers from the dangers they hadn't been able to escape themselves. It wasn't the ending Amos would have chosen for them. They deserved peace, deserved rest, deserved to move on to whatever came after death. But maybe this was close enough. Maybe bearing witness, standing guard, helping others avoid their fate was its own kind of peace. The road went on, as roads always did. Drivers still traveled the Dempster Highway through the polar night, hauling loads to remote settlements, serving the scattered communities of the far north. Most of them never knew about the northern stop station, never learned about the pocket reality that had once fed on vehicles and trapped people outside of time. But some drivers knew. The old-timers who remembered when disappearances were common. The ones who'd heard the warnings and chosen to believe them. The ones who'd seen figures standing beside the road in the darkness and understood what they were witnessing. And when those drivers passed through the area where the station had been, they would sometimes raise a hand in acknowledgement. A silent thank you to the guardians who watched over them, to the trapped drivers who'd found a way to serve even after death, to Hetty Gallows and all the others who'd paid the price for the highway's hunger and now stood between it and future victims. The northern stop station was gone, destroyed by thermite charges and human determination. But its legacy remained, woven into the fabric of the Dempster Highway, a reminder that some places in the world exist outside normal rules, and that the price of using those places can last long after they're destroyed. Amos never went back, but he carried the memory of that highway with him for the rest of his life, and when his time finally came, he died knowing that he'd made a difference. That because of his choices and his courage and his willingness to listen to warnings left behind by the desperate, dozens of future drivers had been saved from the fate that had claimed Hetty Gallows and Bram Corwin and all the others. The highway was cleaner now. The darkness was still absolute, the cold still deadly, the isolation still profound. But the malicious hunger was gone, replaced by something stranger but ultimately kinder. Ghosts standing guard over the living, trapped drivers serving as watchful guardians. Warnings that persisted long after their authors had ceased to exist in any conventional sense. And somewhere in the polar night, on a stretch of highway that passed through empty wilderness, Hetty Gallows still stood watch. Appearing when she was needed, warning when danger threatened, bearing witness to the endless procession of trucks that drove through the darkness toward destinations they would actually reach. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't rest, but it was purpose, and after 36 years of meaningless imprisonment, purpose was enough.